Today, we begin a new, great journey. We'll travel to the banks of a river that gave rise to one of the most impressive civilizations in human history. Prepare to discover the genesis of ancient Egypt from the lifeblood of the Nile, through the first kings and sacred rituals, to the first stones laid to build an empire that would last for millennia. Before temples, before pharaohs, there was a river that not only fertilized the land, but also the myths and soul of the Egyptian people. Today, we will follow the flow of the Nile, this vital vein that gave life and shape to ancient Egypt. Before there were pharaohs, before even the first pyramid dreamed of touching the sky, there was the river. It did not originate in Egypt, the land that would one day define and be defined by it. Its origin is a secret kept much further south, in the pulsating, humid heart of Africa, a place of mist-shrouded mountains and forests, so dense that sunlight reaches the ground in timid beams, as if asking permission to enter. The story of the Nile, the great artery of a civilization, begins not with a roar, but with a whisper. It begins with the persistent drip of rain over the highlands of Burundi and Rwanda, a soft, percussive melody that feeds countless anonymous streams. These small veins of water, fresh and clear, glide between moss-covered rocks and ancient tree roots, seeking one another, joining together into larger streams, in a gravitational dance that pulls them inexorably northward. These waters meet to form the Kagera River, the most distant tributary, which in turn flows into a body of water so vast that the first people to see it must have thought they had reached the end of the world. This is Lake Victoria, an inland freshwater sea, a gigantic mirror reflecting the African sky in all its glory. There, under the equatorial heat, the water rests, calms, as if gathering strength for the monumental journey that awaits it. It is from the northern side of this great lake that the Nile officially emerges, receiving its first name, the White Nile, and the name is perfectly descriptive. Leaving the lake, the river flows through marshes and plains, collecting light-colored clay sediments in its bed. This gives its water a milky, almost opaque appearance, as if carrying the sunlight itself in suspension. The White Nile is unhurried. It flows with majestic serenity, a gentle giant that meanders for thousands of kilometers through Uganda and South Sudan, nurturing lush life along its banks. It flows through the Sud, one of the world's largest wetlands, a nearly impassable expanse of papyrus and water hyacinth, where the river seems to lose itself, spread out, and almost disappear, evaporating under the merciless sun. It's a test of endurance, a watery labyrinth that has challenged explorers for centuries. While the White Nile continues its calm and persistent journey, another Nile is being born, with a completely different personality. Far to the east, in the Ethiopian highlands, monsoon rains feed another lake, Lake Tana. This is the birthplace of the Blue Nile, and if the White Nile is serene and constant, the Blue Nile is impetuous, dramatic, and full of energy. Rising from a volcanic plateau, the Blue Nile roars down deep gorges, its current strong and swift. Its waters don't carry the light clay of its sibling, but rather the dark and incredibly fertile silt of Ethiopia's volcanic soils. This precious mineral-rich cargo would later become the basis of all Egyptian agriculture, the boon that would transform a desert into a granary. The Blue Nile is responsible for over 80% of the Nile's water volume and 90% of its sediment during the flood season. It is the strength, the power, the heart that pumps life into the valley. The two rivers, so different in origin and temperament, travel their separate paths for a vast distance until they finally meet. The meeting place is the city of Khartoum, the capital of present-day Sudan. There, the White Nile, pale and slow, merges with the Blue Nile, dark and swift. The confluence is not an immediate merging. For several kilometers, the two streams flow side by side, one clear and the other dark as if studying each other, dancing a slow ritual of union before becoming a single entity. From this point on, there is only one Nile, a unified river, now more powerful and complete, carrying within it the characteristics of its two parents, the constancy of the white and the strength of the blue. It is now ready to face its greatest challenge, the vast and unforgiving Sahara Desert. After the great embrace in Khartoum, the Nile enters Nubia, a land of sand and rock under a scorching sun. Here, the landscape changes dramatically. The lush green of the banks narrows, becoming a thin ribbon of life squeezed between endless dunes. The river, which once meandered through plains, now struggles, carving its way through granite and sandstone formations. It is in this region that he encounters the famous Nile Falls. For those who hear the name, their minds may wander to gigantic, thundering waterfalls. The reality, however, is more subtle and, for ancient navigators, equally treacherous. The falls are actually a series of 6 rapids, rocky islands, and shallow, turbulent waters that made navigation upstream extremely difficult, if not impossible, for larger vessels. This is a widely known historical fact. These falls served as effective natural borders between Egypt and the Nubian kingdoms to the south. The first cataract, near Aswan, traditionally marked the southern limit of Egypt itself, a natural gateway that controlled access to the heart of the kingdom. Overcoming these barriers required smaller boats and a deep, intimate knowledge of the river, its currents, and its hidden dangers. The mystique of the Nile and the inaccessibility of its sources have always fascinated great civilizations. There's a rather eccentric historical curiosity that illustrates this obsession well. In the 1st century of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Nero, known for his excesses and theatrical curiosity, decided he wanted to uncover the secret of the Nile's source. He sent a small expedition, led by 2 centurions, with the mission of mapping the river to its source. Equipped with legendary Roman tenacity, they journeyed south, beyond the borders of the empire, passing through Egypt and into the unknown lands of Nubia. They overcame the waterfalls and continued on until they reached the vast and impenetrable Sud marshland in present-day South Sudan. There, the great river dissolved into an endless swamp of floating vegetation, an endless labyrinth that completely blocked their passage. The centurions, men accustomed to marching in straight lines and conquering territories, were forced to admit defeat. They returned to Rome and reported to Nero that the river's source was, for all intents and purposes, unreachable. The Nile had kept its secret, defeating the ingenuity and strength of the world's greatest empire with nothing more than mud and aquatic plants. A lesson in humility, perhaps, delivered by a river to an emperor. After passing the last of the waterfalls and the Nubian region, the Nile finally enters the historic territory of Egypt. And here, something magical happens. The river calms, its struggle against the rocks ends, and it widens, flowing slowly and majestically, like a king returning to his throne. The valley opens up, its banks becoming wider and more fertile than at any other point on its journey. This is the Nile of iconography, the river of white-sailed feluccas, the setting for myths and the daily lives of millions of people for millennia. It flows north, passing through sites that would become sacred, Luxor, Thebes, Memphis. It's a liquid highway, a source of life, and a timeline all rolled into one. Finally, after a journey of over 6,600 kilometers, the river approaches its final destination, the Mediterranean Sea. But it doesn't surrender to the sea abruptly. Instead, near the site of present-day Cairo, the Nile begins to divide. It spreads into a myriad of smaller channels and tributaries, opening out like a fan. Or, as the ancient Greeks noted, like the Greek letter delta, from which the region derives its name. The Nile Delta is the apotheosis of the river's bounty. There, the last and richest sediments, carried from the Ethiopian highlands, are deposited, creating one of the most fertile areas on the entire planet. A vast plain of dark, humid earth, a verdant triangle wedged between the desert and the salty sea. It is the river's final gift to the land of Egypt. Fresh water slowly mixes with salt water. The scent of fertile mud meets the sea breeze, and the cycle seems to end for a moment. But it is only a pause. The water that reaches the Mediterranean will evaporate under the sun, form clouds that travel south, and eventually fall as rain on the distant mountains and lakes, so that a new drop of water can begin once again the long and extraordinary journey north. And this eternal circle, this promise of renewal, was not an abstract idea or a distant philosophy for the people who lived nestled along the river. It was the most tangible and powerful reality of their lives, a rhythmic pulse that dictated time, work, hunger, and abundance. It was the great breath of the Nile, and its most dramatic and awaited moment was its annual exhalation, the Great Flood. The river's journey, from the distant mountains to its unfolding in the delta, was only the prelude. The true magic, the central act that defined Egypt's very existence, began with a sign in the sky and a subtle shift in the breeze. After months of unrelenting sun, the land of Egypt became dry and thirsty. The Nile itself seemed to shrink, retreating into its main channel, leaving behind cracked banks that resembled open wounds in the landscape. The air grew heavy, thick with desert dust that seeped into everything, coating the fronds of palms and date palms with a thin yellow film. The world seemed to be holding its breath in a state of dusty stagnation. The painstakingly dug irrigation canals dried up and became mere empty furrows. The animals gathered near the remaining water, and the people looked south, beyond the horizon, waiting. It wasn't an anxious or fearful wait, like that of people who fear destructive and unpredictable floods. It was a patient, trusting wait, the wait for a beloved relative who always returns from a long journey bearing gifts. The celestial sign was the reappearance of the star Sirius, which the Egyptians called Sopdete, in the early morning sky, just before sunrise. This astronomical event, occurring around the end of June, coincided remarkably with the subtle onset of the flood. For the ancient Egyptians, it was no coincidence, but divine confirmation. The universe was in order, and the gods were fulfilling their promise. Shortly after Sirius's return to the sky, the first physical signs arrived. The most attentive observers, stationed at lookout posts along the river on the southern border, in Aswan, noticed the change. The water, which had been low and relatively clear, began to rise. Slowly but inexorably, and its color changed. At first, it took on a greenish hue, the result of tropical plants and algae swept from the southern marshland by the White Nile's initial rise. But this was only the forefront. The real main event was underway, driven by the distant fury of the Blue Nile. When the flood wave from Ethiopia arrived, the transformation was complete. The water turned a deep brownish red, the color of the rich volcanic soil it carried with it. This was the Red Nile, a river of lifeblood, not death. The water level rose more steeply each day. The sound of the valley changed. The dusty silence was replaced by the growing whisper of water, a steady murmur that became a powerful flowing sound. The smell changed too. The dry odor of dust gave way to the damp, earthy aroma of moving water and mud, a scent of promise and fertility. The flood wasn't a destructive wall of water. It was a gradual, almost polite rise. The water first filled the main riverbed until it overflowed, then gently spread over the banks, advancing over the parched fields. It covered the lowlands, filled the dry irrigation canals, and continued to expand, rising relentlessly. At the height of the flood, usually in mid-September, Egypt's landscape transformed dramatically. Where once there had been a valley with a river in the center, there was now a vast, serene lake, stretching from one side of the desert cliffs to the other. The arable land disappeared completely beneath the dark, calm waters. The towns and villages, wisely built on slightly higher ground, became temporary islands, connected only by high dikes or boats. The tops of the palm trees emerged from the water, as if sprouting from an infinite lake. The Egyptian world was remade, reduced to its essential elements: water, sky, and the small patches of land where human life was concentrated. This period was known as Akhet, the season of the flood, and surprisingly, it was a time of relative agricultural inactivity, and therefore, of other forms of work and celebration. With the fields submerged, there was no way to plow, sow, or harvest. Life changed its rhythm. This forced agricultural retreat was actually a blessing in disguise for Egypt's rulers. The widely known historical fact associated with this period is that the flood season was the prime time for the construction of the state's great monuments. With a vast workforce of temporarily unemployed farmers, the pharaoh had an army of laborers at his disposal for his construction projects, and the flood itself helped. The waters that covered the valley created an unparalleled water transportation network, a liquid highway that reached the base of the desert plateaus. Massive blocks of limestone and granite, extracted from distant quarries, could be loaded onto large barges and floated with relative ease to the construction sites of the pyramids and temples. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, would have been a logistically impossible project without the Nile's annual floods to transport the millions of tons of stone needed. The river not only nourished the people, but also helped build the eternal tombs of their kings and the homes of their gods, a complete service from a very helpful river god. However, the Nile's benevolence was not something to be taken for granted. The flood was a gift, but its quality varied. Too low a flood meant the water wouldn't reach all the farmland, and insufficient sediment would be deposited. The result would be a poor harvest and the threat of famine. On the other hand, an excessively high flood could be disastrous, destroying levees, inundating villages built on lower ground, and causing damage and loss of life. Predictability was key to survival and prosperity, and this brings us to a fascinating and deeply practical historical curiosity: the Nilometer. The Egyptians not only observed the flood, they measured it with scientific precision. At various points along the river, especially at important sites such as Elephantine, Memphis, and later Cairo, they built ingenious structures called nilometers. These could take various forms: a staircase descending into the river with level marks engraved on its walls, a deep well connected to the river by an underground channel with a central column, marked to indicate the water's height, or simply a set of markings on a cliff at the river's edge. Priests and officials monitored the Nilometer daily during the flood season. The measurements were recorded and had immense implications. An ideal flood was considered one that reached about 16 cubits, approximately 8 meters, on the Memphis Nilometer. If the readings indicated a weak flood, the state could prepare for shortages by releasing grain from its warehouses. If it indicated a dangerously high flood, communities could be warned to reinforce their levees and prepare to evacuate. But there was also a more cynical and bureaucratic aspect. Nilometer readings were the basis for Egypt's tax system. The height of the flood determined the amount of land that would be fertilized and, therefore, the expected crop yield. Based on this data, the pharaoh's scribes calculated the taxes that would be levied on farmers in the following season. A generous flood meant a bountiful harvest and, consequently, higher taxes. It was a brilliant way to ensure that the prosperity generated by the river was duly shared with the royal treasury. The Nilometer was thus an instrument of science, religion, and, perhaps most importantly, fiscal administration. As the months of Akhet passed, the water reached its peak and slowly began to recede. This was the beginning of the second season of the Egyptian calendar, Pere, the season of emergence. Beginning in October, the vast lake began to shrink. The water flowed back into the main riverbed, revealing the land that had been submerged. And what was this land? What emerged were not the dry, cracked plains of before, but a transformed landscape. The river, in its retreat, left behind its greatest gift, a thick, wet, dark layer of incredibly fertile silt. It was Kemet, the Black Land, which gave Egypt its ancient name. This silt was a perfect blend of organic matter and minerals, brought from the heart of Africa and freely deposited at the feet of Egyptian farmers. The scent of wet earth and new life hung over the entire valley. The view was of a shiny black carpet, contrasting dramatically with the Desert, the red earth of the Stereo Desert that stretched just beyond the flood's reach. This sharp demarcation between life and non-life, between the black earth and the red earth, was Egypt's most fundamental geographical reality. It was a visual frontier that shaped its people's cosmology and worldview. The Nile Valley was order, life, civilization. The desert was chaos, death, the unknown. The annual flood was the divine act that pushed back the chaos and reaffirmed the dominance of life. With the land newly fertilized and still soft with moisture, the cycle of agricultural work could begin again. Farmers emerged from their island villages, now reconnected by land, and began preparing the fields for planting. The soil was so soft that plowing was minimal. The cycle of life, interrupted by water, was ready to begin again with renewed vitality. The flood was not, therefore, an isolated event, but the engine of a perpetual cycle of pause, renewal, and activity. It was the beating heart that ensured that year after year, the desert could not swallow the thin, stubborn ribbon of life that was Egypt. With the delicacy of a veil being lifted, the water withdrew, and the land, freed from its watery embrace, breathed again. What unfolded was not a devastated landscape, but rather a renewed miracle, a gift laid with an almost ceremonial kindness. This was the moment when the river's promise became tangible, a banquet of possibilities spread out beneath the Egyptian sun. The air, for weeks filled with the dominant presence of water, now carried a different scent, denser and more promising. It was the smell of wet earth, a primordial aroma of mineral humus and budding life. The Egyptians called this gift Kemet, the black earth, and it was the foundation of their existence. When you stepped on it, The ground yielded with a soft, dark sigh, almost like damp velvet. It wasn't the compacted, reluctant earth of other regions, demanding to be broken and tamed by heavy plows and the sweat of many men. This land was an offering. It invited planting, almost begging for the seeds that would soon become the bread and beer of an entire nation. The contrast with the desert, the red desert earth that rose just steps away, could not be more stark. On one side, an endless reddish infertility, an ocean of sand where nothing grew. On the other, this dark, fertile carpet, a stubborn lifeline drawn by the river. Living in Egypt was living on this frontier, in this constant dialogue between abundance and emptiness. The beginning of agricultural work, which followed the receding of the waters, had the quality of a calm ritual. Farming families descended from their elevated villages, bringing their animals and simple tools. The first step was to prepare the field, but perhaps preparing is too grand a word for what was happening. The early Egyptian plow was a lightweight tool, little more than a fire-hardened wooden point, designed to gently scrape the surface of the soft mud, creating shallow furrows. It was often pulled by a pair of oxen, which moved with drowsy slowness, or in smaller fields by 2 men. The plow didn't need to fight the soil, it simply caressed it, opening it for the next step. The sound that dominated the valley wasn't that of strenuous effort, but a murmur of gentle activity, the call of men to their animals, the sound of timber sliding through the mud. Then came the sowing, an act of sublime trust. The farmer walked through the field with a leather or cloth bag filled with seeds, tossing them with a broad, rhythmic gesture. The seeds fell onto the fertile mud, tiny promises of life scattered across the dark earth. And then came one of the most ingenious and, by modern standards, somewhat comical solutions in Egyptian agriculture. Instead of going to the trouble of burying the seeds with rakes or other tools, they simply turned their animals loose on the newly planted field. Herds of sheep, goats, or even pigs were led to trample the area. The animals' hooves, as they moved, pressed the seeds into the soft soil, burying them at the perfect depth for germination, while also conveniently adding a little extra fertilizer. It was a lazy and brilliant symbiosis, a partnership between man, animal, and land that minimized effort and maximized efficiency. Work was done at nature's pace, not against it. The seeds they sowed with such faith were primarily 2 types of grains that would become the backbone of their civilization. This is a widely known historical fact. The Egyptian diet and economy were built on emmer wheat and barley. Emmer wheat, a robust and ancient grain, was ground into coarse flour, which was then made into dense, flat breads. It was a bread that sustained, though the sand and dust that inevitably mixed with the flour during milling had a devastating effect on the teeth of everyone, from pharaoh to peasant, as the mummies attest with their worn smiles. Barley, in turn, had a perhaps even more important destiny. Beer, henket, as they called it, was not the clear, carbonated beverage we know today. It was a thick, nutritious, and slightly alcoholic liquid, more like a liquid porridge. It was a crucial source of calories, vitamins, and, above all, a safer drink than river water, which could be contaminated. Beer was a food, a form of wages, and an offering to the gods. It was the liquid fuel that powered Egyptian society. The land's bounty was such that production often exceeded immediate needs. This surplus was the true engine of civilization. It needed to be stored, accounted for, and distributed. And this brings us to a fascinating historical curiosity about ancient Egypt's value system. In an economy that long operated without minted currency, value was measured in goods. Grain and beer were standard forms of payment, but other agricultural products also had an established value. Among these, one of the most humble and ubiquitous was the onion. Onions grew easily in fertile soil, were nutritious, and could be stored for long periods. They were so fundamental to the diet and economy that they were used as a form of payment for the workers who built the Great Pyramids. Papyri discovered record the daily rations provided to these men, which included bread, beer, and, invariably, large quantities of onions and garlic. It's a somewhat prosaic and, at the same time, deeply human image. Thousands of men erected monuments to eternity, fed and paid with one of the world's most basic vegetables. The onion, with its strong aroma and many layers, was, in a sense, a currency with which a king could buy immortality. However, the Nile's fertility was not infinite. After sowing, the sun began its relentless work. The dark mud, initially saturated with moisture, began to dry and crack under the heat. The young wheat and barley plants needed water to survive and grow. The river had been nearby, but now flowed low in its bed. Getting the river's water to distant fields became the next great challenge and the next great innovation. The first irrigation efforts were communal and ingenious in their simplicity. Farmers built networks of low dikes made of Nile mud and straw, which divided the floodplains into large basins. When the floods arrived, these basins trapped the water and silt, allowing the land to remain submerged longer and absorb more moisture. It was a passive but effective system that maximized the flood's potential. But to irrigate during the growing season, a more active approach was required. And thus was born one of the most iconic and enduring machines of the Egyptian landscape, the Zaduf. Its genius lay in its simplicity. It consisted of a long wooden pole mounted like a lever on a pillar. At one end of the pole hung a container, usually a leather bucket or a clay pot. At the other end hung a heavy counterweight made of a large stone or a mound of dried mud. The Zaduf operator simply had to pull the end of the pole with the bucket down, submerging it in the water of the river or a main canal. The counterweight did almost all the work of lifting the bucket full of water. With a gentle push, the operator could then rotate the pole and dump the water into a higher irrigation channel, which would carry it to the fields. The work was repetitive, but the lever's design greatly reduced the effort. Imagine the sound of the valley during the growing season. The pair would be punctuated by the rhythmic, comforting creak of hundreds of Zadufs in operation. The sound of wood against wood, the gentle dip of the bucket into the water, the brief silence as it was lifted, and then the gurgling sound of water being poured, bringing life to the thirsty roots. It was the soundtrack of human endeavor, working in harmony with the principles of physics and the needs of the earth. This simple device allowed the Egyptians to cultivate land further from the main riverbed and ensure a second or even third harvest in some areas. It dramatically increased land productivity and, with it, the kingdom's wealth and stability. This stewardship of land and water, born of necessity and careful observation, was what allowed agriculture to flourish. And agriculture, in turn, changed everything. The ability to produce a reliable surplus of food meant that, for the first time in human history in that region, not everyone needed to dedicate their lives to foraging. This surplus freed people. It freed them to become artisans, creating the pottery needed to store grain and brew beer. He freed them to become priests, dedicated to understanding and appeasing the gods who controlled the river and the sun. He freed them to become soldiers, to protect the fertile land from the desires of their desert neighbors. And, crucially, he freed them to become scribes and administrators, men who would create a system for recording crops, collecting taxes, and organizing great building projects. The fertility of the banks didn't just produce grain. It generated free time, specialization, and, ultimately, the complex structure of a civilization. Everything sprang from that dark, generous mud, deposited year after year by the patient river. With the soil prepared and the promise of grain nestled in the dark earth, time itself needed to be measured, not in hours and minutes, but in phases of being and doing, in cycles of waiting and working. If agriculture was the body of Egyptian civilization, the calendar was its soul, a way of giving name and structure to the inexorable rhythm imposed by the river. History could not be written without a sense of time, and time in Egypt was not a straight line, but a serene, recurring circle, mirroring the eternal journey of its aquatic creator. The ancient Egyptians didn't need wristwatches or notifications on their papyrus phones, which, incidentally, didn't exist. Time announced itself in much more visceral and impossible-to-ignore ways. The passing of the seasons wasn't marked by a date on a scroll, but by a change in the smell of the air, the color of the water, the sound the valley made. Their calendar was a masterpiece of pragmatic observation, a system born not of mathematical abstraction, but of the sensory experience of living beside a river with a very strong personality and a very clear agenda. They divided the year into 3 seasons, each with 4 30-day months, each corresponding to a distinct act in the great annual play performed by the Nile. The first season, the beginning of the year, was Akhet, the inundation. It began, as we've seen, with the reappearance of the star Sirius and the arrival of the red waters. This wasn't a time of field work, but a time of enforced stillness and a different energy. Imagine the world transforming into a vast, tranquil lake. The predominant sound was not the wind in the wheat fields or the sound of pack animals, but the soft, steady whisper of water against the village dikes. Journeys were made by boat, gliding silently over fields that, months later, would be traversed on foot. The air was heavy with humidity, and the smell was of clean water and suspended silt. It was a time of introspection, repairing tools, weaving baskets, and telling stories. Families gathered in the confined spaces of their homes, and community life intensified on the islands of dry land that were their villages. The outside world was on pause, submerged in a baptism that washed the land and prepared it for rebirth. For the state, as we saw, it was peak construction season. But for the farmer, it was the great sigh of the year, a time to rest the muscles and trust that the river was doing the heavy lifting. When the waters receded, the world exhaled, and the second season began. Perete, the season of emergence or growth. This was the season of doing. The scent of wet, fertile earth dominated everything. Akhet's watery silence was replaced by a symphony of activity. The sound of wooden plows scraping the soft mud, the men's calls to their oxen, the bleating of sheep trampling the seeds, and above all, the rhythmic, constant creaking of shadufs lifting life-giving river water to the fields. Visually, it was the most dramatic season. The black carpet of fresh mud was soon dotted with a tender, vibrant green. Tiny shoots of wheat and barley poked through the soil, growing visibly each day under the Egyptian sun, which now shone with increasing intensity. Life burst forth in a lush green. It was a time of hard work, yes, but work filled with purpose and optimism. Each plant that grew was a testament to the cycle's effectiveness, a confirmation that order had triumphed over chaos once again. It was the season of visible hope, of tangible growth. And then, as the green turned to gold in the ever-increasing heat, the third and final season arrived. It was Zemu, the harvest or low-water season. The Nile was now at its lowest point, a lazy river curled up in its bed. The once humid air became dry and heavy with dust. The sun was a relentless master, and the earth, far from the irrigation canals, dried and cracked. This was the season of final effort and reward. The once green valley now undulated with fields of golden wheat and barley, heavy with grain. The defining sound was that of thousands of flint and wooden sickles cutting through the dry stalks in a continuous rustling. This was followed by the sound of cattle trampling the grain on the threshing floors to separate the chaff, a noisy, dusty process that filled the air with a golden haze. The smell was of dry straw, sun-baked grain, and dust. It was exhausting work in the scorching heat. But eventually, the barns were filled. Bread and beer for the coming year were assured, and when the harvest ended and the fields lay bare and parched, anxiety began to rise again. The people looked to the sky, searching for the return of the Syrians. They looked south, waiting for the first signs of the flood. The cycle was complete, and the world held its breath, awaiting the beginning of Akhet once again. This three-season structure dictated by the river was the backbone of Egyptian time. However, the administrators and priests, with their love of order and predictability, felt the need to formalize it. And herein lies a widely known historical fact. The Egyptians created one of the oldest and most accurate solar calendars in the ancient world. They observed that the complete cycle, from one flood to the next, took about 3 days. So they constructed their official, or civil, calendar with elegant mathematical simplicity. Each of the 3 seasons, Akhet, Pere, and Shemu, was divided into 4 months of exactly 30 days each. This totaled 360 days. For a people who valued harmony and balance, round numbers were immensely satisfying. 12 months, 30 days each. Clean, orderly, perfect. But reality, as always, was a bit messier. They knew the year didn't exactly have 360 days. There were 5 days left over. Instead of trying to clumsily fit them into the existing months, they did something much more dramatic. They added these 5 days at the end of the year, after the last day of Chemu and before the first day of Akhet. These days, known as the epigomenal days, were a time outside of time. They belonged to no particular month and were considered a dangerous period, charged with supernatural power. Egyptian mythology explained their origins in a marvelous way. The sun god, Ra, had decreed that the sky goddess, Nut, could not give birth on any day of the 360-day year. Desperate, she turned to Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic. Thoth played a board game with the moon god and gained enough light to create 5 extra days. In these 5 days, outside of Ra's original calendar, Nut was finally able to give birth to her 5 divine children: Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. Each of the 5 epigomenal days was considered the birthday of one of these gods. These were days of festivals and rituals, but also of great anxiety. It was believed that the world was unstable during this period, that the boundaries between the world of the living and the dead were tenuous. People avoided starting any important work and performed protective rituals to safely cross this perilous bridge between one year and the next. This solution, while mythologically beautiful, hid a subtle problem that leads us to a fascinating historical curiosity about the nature of bureaucracy. The true solar year is not 365 days, but approximately and a quarter. Egyptian astronomers knew this. They could observe that the heliacal rising of Sirius, the true natural marker of the new year, occurred a quarter of a day later each year on their 365-day civil calendar. It may not seem like much, but this small discrepancy added up. Every 4 years, the civil calendar would shift a full day ahead of the solar year and the actual seasons. Every 120 years, it would shift a full month ahead. After a period of 1,000 solar years, known as the Sothic cycle, the civil calendar would have shifted by a full year and finally realigned with the seasons. This created a delightfully absurd situation. Imagine a scribe in the pharaoh's palace in a year when the calendar had shifted significantly. He would dip his quill in ink and officially declare it. Today is the first day of the first month of Akhet, the season of flooding. Meanwhile, outside the palace window, the Nile would be at its lowest, the fields would be dry and cracked under the Shamu sun, and the farmers would be sweating to gather the harvest. There would be a complete disconnect between official, bureaucratic time and the real, physical time that everyone could see and feel. The Egyptians, being eminently practical, simply lived with this duality. They had a rigid and unchanging civil calendar, which was used for contracts, tax records, and historical annals. It was the time of government, and at the same time, they had a natural calendar, flexible and based on observation of the river and the stars, which dictated when to plow, sow, and harvest. It was God's or the gods' time. They never officially adjusted the civil calendar by adding a leap day, as we do today. To do so would perhaps be to admit that their original system, so mathematically clean, was imperfect. And for a culture that so valued stability and eternity, the idea of an immutable calendar, even if it was wrong about nature, had its own appeal. It was a pillar of constancy in a world that, despite the regularity of the Nile, was still unpredictable. Pharaoh Meltersius, a ruler of the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt much later, attempted to introduce a leap day in the 3rd century BC, but the idea was firmly rejected by the conservative clergy and the population. It was a tradition too ancient to be changed. Thus, for millennia, the Egyptians lived in 2 time periods, the time of the scribes and the time of the farmers, one calendar for the administration of civilization and another for its survival. This division, this calendar that moved slowly like a sand dune through the seasons, is a silent testament to the Egyptian mentality. A unique blend of precise observation of nature, a deep need for bureaucratic order, and a reverent stubbornness in maintaining traditions, even when reality itself seemed to gently suggest that a small update might be helpful. With the order of time firmly established, woven from observation of the stars and the behavior of the river, humanity could finally stop wandering. The calendar was not just a tool to predict the flood or the harvest. It was a permission to put down roots, a guarantee that if one had the patience to wait, life would return. The black earth promised and given each year was an irresistible invitation to build a home. And so, along the thin ribbon of life, squeezed between 2 deserts, the first whispers of settled life began to take shape. Not in grand cities, but in humble clusters of hope and mud. Long before any pharaoh wore a double crown or any scribe recorded a king's accomplishments, there was the village. It wasn't born from a decree or a grand urban plan. It was born from necessity, logic, and the fundamental human desire for a place to call one's own. The catalyst for this monumental change, this act of tying oneself to a piece of land, was, of course, agriculture. This is the widely known historical fact that underpins not only the history of Egypt, but that of civilization itself. The Neolithic Revolution. The discovery that one could deliberately grow one's own food rather than foraging or gathering what nature randomly provided was the turning point. And nowhere in the ancient world was this transition as smooth and inviting as in the Nile Valley. Why follow wandering herds across a scorching desert when a benevolent river god deposited a self-fertilizing field at your doorstep each year? The choice was obvious. Nomadic life, once a necessity for survival, became unnecessarily arduous labor compared to partnering with the river. The first communities did not spring up recklessly on the immediate banks. The early Egyptians were astute observers and knew that the river, though generous, demanded respect. Building a house on the floodplain would be like building a sandcastle at high tide, an exercise in doomed optimism. Instead, they sought the slightly higher points of the terrain. These were the Jasiras, or sand islands, which geologists call turtlebacks, small natural elevations, remnants of older dunes or sandbars left by past floods, which remained above water or became islands during the peak of the Akhet flood. These sites were prime real estate in pre-dynastic Egypt. They offered the best of both worlds, immediate access to fertile land when the waters receded and a safe haven when the river swelled. For a few months each year, the village became a small island, a microcosm of Egypt itself, surrounded by water. Building materials were literally beneath their feet. There was no need for distant quarries or cutting down non-existent forests. The material was the very essence of Egypt: Nile mud. By mixing the sticky mud with water and a binder, usually chopped straw, animal dung, or sand, they created a thick, malleable substance. This mixture was then pressed into rectangular wooden molds and left to dry under the relentless gaze of the Egyptian sun. The result was the mud brick, or adobe, the fundamental building block of all Egyptian vernacular architecture for millennia. The process of building a house was a communal affair, accompanied by the soft, moist sound of mud being mixed, the smell of wet earth and straw drying in the sun, and the heat radiating from the newly formed bricks. It was an organic architecture, born from the very earth that sustained the people. The houses they built were functionally simple and elegant. They were rectangular structures with thick walls that provided remarkable insulation against the heat of the day and the surprising cold of the desert nights. The roofs were flat, made of a layer of palm trunks or papyrus reeds covered with more mud and straw. This roof wasn't just a covering, it was an additional living space. On hot, muggy nights, the entire family would move to the roof to sleep under the stars, enjoying the breeze that couldn't penetrate the house's interior. During the day, the roof was used to dry grain, dates, or fish, and as a workspace for tasks such as mending fishing nets or weaving. Windows were small openings positioned high in the walls, not so much for views, but to allow hot air to escape and a little light to enter, minimizing direct sunlight and omnipresent dust. The interior of a villager's house was a sanctuary of shady coolness. The floor was packed earth, smoothed and smoothed until it became a hard, cool surface. The furniture was minimal and multifunctional. A few clay pots for storing water, grain, and beer, perhaps a reed mat for sleeping, and a grinding stone in the corner, the housewife's most important tool, used to grind durum wheat into flour. Cooking was often done outdoors in a courtyard or in a small fireplace indoors. the smoke from which found its way out through a hole in the roof. It was a life stripped of luxuries, but not of comfort or dignity. The mud walls, though simple, were often whitewashed with white plaster, making the interior brighter and cleaner. Sometimes the more artistically inclined painted simple geometric patterns or scenes of river life on the interior walls, the first glimpses of the Egyptian passion for decoration. Life within these villages was intensely communal. Houses were clustered together, separated by narrow, winding alleys, which offered shade from the sun and created a sense of intimacy and mutual protection. There were no fences or rigid notions of private property as we know them. Life spilled from the houses into the alleys and shared courtyards. The constant sound of the village would be a tapestry of human and animal noises. The crying of children, the clucking of chickens, the bleating of a goat, the barking of a dog. Above all, there would be the rhythmic, persistent sound of grinding grain, an endless task performed by women who spent hours kneeling, pushing a smaller stone onto a larger saddle stone. It was the soundtrack of survival, the sound that meant there would be bread for the evening meal. They lived close to nature, but also in constant negotiation with its dangers. Life on the riverbank meant access to fish and waterfowl, but also to crocodiles, which lurked in the shallows, and to hippos, surprisingly aggressive and territorial animals that could easily capsize a small fishing boat. Dry land brought its own fears. Scorpions that hid in pots or sandals, and snakes, especially the asp, whose bite was fatal. This proximity to danger imbued daily life with a profound need for magical protection, and this leads us to a deeply personal and enchanting historical curiosity. When building their homes, the ancient Egyptians were concerned not only with structural stability, they were concerned with spiritual stability. It was common to incorporate magical or apotropaic objects into the very structure of the house. Before laying the first row of bricks, a family might bury small offerings in the foundation. An amulet, a jar of grain to ensure prosperity, or, more commonly, small figurines of protective deities. The god Anambes, with his grotesque but benevolent appearance, was a favorite to protect the home from evil, especially during childbirth. The hippopotamus goddess Taweret, another fierce-looking deity who protected mothers and children, was also popular. Sometimes, a special magic brick was created. This was an ordinary clay brick on which a priest or learned family member would inscribe a protective spell before it dried. This brick was then placed in a strategically important location, such as under the threshold of the front door, so that any malevolent spirit or dangerous creature attempting to enter would be repelled by the power contained within. It's a wonderful image. The house was not just a physical shelter, but a magical fortress, every threshold and foundation imbued with prayers and spells to keep the family safe. It was the perfect fusion of practicality and belief, a reminder that, for the Egyptians, the physical and spiritual worlds were never truly separate. Over time, these villages grew, families expanded, houses multiplied, and small islands of habitation became increasingly complex centers of life. Specialization began to emerge on a small scale. A man might be particularly skilled at making ceramic pots, trading his pots for fish from his neighbor, who was a more skilled fisherman. A woman might be known for her skill in weaving fine linen, exchanging her fabrics for another family's surplus grain. The market, in its most rudimentary form of exchange and barter, emerged in the open spaces of these villages. A local leader emerged, perhaps a council of elders, or a village chief, someone respected for their wisdom or bravery, who helped resolve disputes over land or water use and organize the maintenance of community dikes and canals. These riverside villages, with their mud houses and communal life, were the living bricks from which Egyptian civilization would be built. They were the cellular units of a larger organism that was slowly taking shape. Each village was a world unto itself, with its own customs, its own shrines to local gods, and its own rhythm of life dictated by the river that flowed alongside. But the same river that isolated them during the flood was also the road that connected them. The steady northward current was an invitation to travel, to exchange, to discover what lay beyond the next bend in the river. The village was home, the anchorage, but the Nile was the gateway to the world. It was along this watery artery that ideas, goods, and eventually power began to flow, slowly uniting these hundreds of small communities into something much, much larger. The journey from mud to majesty had indeed begun, but for these hundreds of small communities to unite into something greater, they needed more than a waterway and a system of bartering. They needed a common history, a shared truth that explained why their lives were the way they were. And in Egypt, all stories, all truths, and all questions inevitably flowed back to the river. The Nile wasn't just the stage where life unfolded. It was the scriptwriter, the director of the play, and the main character. It was inevitable that, in the minds of the people he nurtured, the river would transcend geography and become the very essence of divinity. To the ancient Egyptian, the idea of separating the physical world from the spiritual world would have been as foreign as separating breathing from the act of living. The landscape was not an inert backdrop. It was a living body, pulsating with meaning and power, and the Nile was its beating heart. Observing the river was not an act of secular science, but of practical theology. Each change in its color, level, and rhythm was a divine communication, a message from the gods to be read and interpreted. The river's regularity did not make it mundane. On the contrary, it made it the most consistent and reliable proof of cosmic order, of Ma'at, the fundamental principle of truth, balance, and justice that governed the entire universe. Thus, the Nile ceased to be just a river. It became an idea, a myth, the earthly manifestation of the act of creation itself. Egyptian cosmology, in its many and varied forms, invariably began with water. Before there was light, gods or men, there was the Nuh, a primordial ocean, dark, infinite, and formless. It was a watery abyss of chaos and potential, containing within itself the seed of all that would come to be. And from these primordial waters emerged the first patch of dry land, the primordial mount, known as Enben. It was on this first island, this first safe place amidst the aquatic chaos, that the creator god, be it Atum, Ra, or Ptah, depending on the theological tradition, manifested himself and began the work of shaping the universe. Now imagine being an Egyptian farmer. Year after year, you witnessed this exact myth unfold before your eyes. The flood of Akht arrived, submerging the known world in a vast, dark, silent lake. Their land, their reality, returned to the watery state of Nuh. And then, as the waters receded, what emerged first? The highest points, the small hills, and the high banks. Mount Primordial. And upon this newborn land, dark and fertile, life exploded in vibrant green. Each year, the creation of the world was not a distant story told by priests. It was a participatory spectacle. The farmer who cast his seeds into the mud wasn't just planting wheat. He was participating in the divine act of creation, helping to reaffirm order over chaos. The Nile, therefore, was not just a river that flooded. It was the manifest Num, the cosmic womb from which the world was annually reborn. A being so central and powerful could not remain an anonymous force. He needed a face, a personality, and thus was born Rape, the divine personification of the flood. Rape was not the god of the river itself, the river as a static geographical entity, but rather the god of the flood, of the event, of overflowing bounty. His iconography is one of the most unique and revealing in the Egyptian pantheon. He was portrayed as a male figure, with a large belly and pendulous breasts, unmistakable symbols of fertility and nourishment. He was, at once, the father and mother of the land of Egypt. His skin was often painted green or blue, the colors of water and vegetation. On his head, he wore a headdress of aquatic plants, usually papyrus or lotus. He was not a warrior god or a distant celestial king. Rape was a god of abundance, a portly and contented provider whose greatest concern was ensuring everyone had enough to eat. Offerings to him were not to appease his wrath, but to encourage his generosity. The hymns implored him to come at the right time and in the right measure, not too little, lest hunger befall, nor too much, lest destruction befall. He was said to live in a cave near the first waterfall in Aswan, from where he emerged each year to bring the flood. He was not a god who required monumental temples, though he was revered throughout Egypt. His true temple was the valley itself, and his most important ritual was the simple act of overflowing. The Nile, however, was more than a creator and a provider. It was also a border and a pathway. Its north-south orientation divided the known world into two clear halves, the East Bank and the West Bank, and this geographical division acquired profound symbolic meaning. The sun, the manifestation of the god Ra, rose every morning on the East Bank. Therefore, the East became the land of the living, the place of dawn, the beginning of activity. It was on the East Bank that most of the great cities, such as Thebes and Memphis, were built. It was where life pulsed. At the end of the day, the sun set in the west, plunging the desert into darkness. Thus, the West Bank inevitably became the land of the dead. It is a widely known historical fact that necropolises, cemeteries, and large funerary complexes, such as the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, were almost all built on the west bank of the Nile. Crossing the river from east to west was not just a change of location. It was the beginning of the journey to the afterlife. A pharaoh's funeral procession, with the body transported in a ceremonial barge across the river, was a reenactment of this cosmic passage. The Nile was the thin line between this world and the next. This idea of the river as a pathway to other dimensions was elaborated in exquisite detail. The Egyptians believed that the terrestrial Nile was merely a reflection of a celestial Nile, a great river that traversed the heavens and on which the sun god Ra sailed in his solar bark during the day. At night, Ra continued his journey on a subterranean Nile that flowed through the Duat, the underworld. This was a dangerous journey, filled with monsters and demons, with the serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos, posing the greatest threat. Ra had to defeat Apophis every night so the sun could rise again the next morning. The deceased's journey into the afterlife mirrored Ra's nocturnal journey. Funeral texts, such as the Book of the Dead, were essentially maps and spell guides to help the soul safely navigate the perilous waters of Duat, pass through its guarded gates, and finally reach the reed fields, the Egyptian paradise. The river, therefore, flowed through all levels of existence, the living world, the heavens, and the underworld. It was the artery that connected all creation. This personification and systematization of the river's fertility leads us to a fascinating and visually rich historical curiosity. In the reliefs that covered the walls of the great temples, especially in the lower rows near the ground, Egyptian artists sculpted long processions of figures known as fecundity figures. They were personifications of the various nomes, districts of Egypt, or different aspects of the Nile's abundance. They all share a slender appearance, corpulent, with prominent bellies and breasts, symbolizing fertility. Each carries a tray or altar on her head, laden with the produce of her particular region: bread, beer, cattle, fish, flax. They march in an orderly, endless line, bringing the earth's riches as an eternal offering to the temple god, or the deified pharaoh. It is as if the Nile's bounty itself had been orchestrated by the Egyptian bureaucratic mind. It was not a chaos of abundance, but an orderly procession of blessings, each duly accounted for and presented. Walking along the base of a temple wall was like seeing a divine catalog of the river's bounty, a promise in stone that the Nile, through its many agents, would always provide. The most profound and human narrative of all, however, was the one that intertwined the river's cycle with the fate of one of its most beloved gods, Osiris. The myth of Osiris is the fundamental drama of Egyptian mythology, a story of love, betrayal, death, and resurrection that perfectly echoed the annual cycle of the Nile. Osiris was a benevolent king who brought civilization to humanity, teaching them agriculture and law. His envious brother, Seth, the god of chaos and disorder, murdered him. In one version of the myth, Seth drowned Osiris in the Nile. In another, more famous, he tricked him into entering a coffin, which he sealed and threw into the river. The coffin floated down the Nile, finally reaching the coast of Phoenicia. Osiris's faithful wife and sister, the powerful magician Isis, searched tirelessly for his body. When she found it, Seth, in his rage, stole the body and dismembered it into 14 pieces, scattering them throughout the land of Egypt. Isis, in her grief, did not give up. She traveled through Egypt, collecting every piece of her husband except one, his phallus, which had been eaten by a fish in the Nile. Using her magic, she reconstructed it, wrapped it in bandages, thus becoming the first mummy, and briefly resurrected it, long enough to conceive her son, Horus. Osiris, however, could no longer reign over the world of the living. He descended to become the righteous ruler of the underworld, the king of the dead. This powerful story resonated at every level of the Egyptian experience. The death of Osiris and the drought of the land during the season of Shemu were one and the same. Isis's tears, as she searched for her husband, were the flood itself, the waters that brought life back. The growth of wheat and barley from the water-soaked soil was not just agriculture. It was Osiris's resurrection. The green with which Osiris was often depicted was the color of reborn vegetation. The river was not only the setting for this divine drama, it was an active participant, the vehicle of Osiris's death, the hiding place of his body, and the source of resurrection through his wife's tears. To live beside the Nile was to live within the myth of Osiris, witnessing his death and his triumph over it each year. Mythology wasn't fantasy. It was simply the language they developed to speak the truth about the river. And the most immediate truth, after satisfied hunger and quenched thirst, was that of movement. The same river that was a god, a myth, and a calendar was also, in its most humble and practical manifestation, a road, and in a land where the wheel was a late concept, and the desert a nearly insurmountable obstacle. It was the only road that mattered. The current that carried Osiris's coffin to the sea was the same one that carried a barge of grain to the pharaoh's storehouse. The path to the afterlife was also the path to the market in the neighboring village, as agriculture created a surplus and villages became fixed points in the landscape. The next question became inevitable: how to move things. Moving a sack of wheat from your land to your granary was one thing. Moving 100 sacks of wheat from your village to an administrative center dozens of kilometers away was a challenge of another order. Trying to do this by land would be a nightmare. The donkeys, though sturdy, could carry a limited load and needed to be fed and watered. The terrain away from the river was a mix of soft sand and steep rock, an invitation to exhaustion and disaster. But the solution flowed, literally and serenely, right in the middle of it all. The Nile wasn't just a source. It was a transportation solution of divine elegance and simplicity. It offered a two-way system, a gift of physics that seemed like a magic spell designed specifically for the Egyptian people's convenience. The first part of this gift was the current. Like all waters that flow to the sea, the Nile flowed inexorably northward, from its origins in Central Africa to its confluence with the Mediterranean. To travel north, to descend the river toward the delta, a boatman needed to do almost nothing. He could simply release his vessel into the current, use a long oar at the stern as a rudder to avoid the sandbars and banks, and let the river do the work. Imagine the tranquility of such a voyage, the boat gliding over the dark water with a gentle whisper. The only sound the occasional dip of the steering oar and the distant calls of waterfowl. The sun warming the traveler's back, the landscape unfolding in a slow panorama of palm groves, green fields, and adobe villages passing by as if in a dream. This was the journey of heavy cargo, of volume. Heavy barges loaded to the brim with grain, livestock, pottery, or limestone blocks would be sent downriver, floating lazily with the patient assistance of the current. It was the ancient equivalent of rolling a boulder down a hill. But what about the return journey? How to go south against the current? Here came the second part of the present, the perfect complement. It is a widely known historical fact that the dominant weather pattern in Egypt is a wind that blows consistently from the north, coming from the Mediterranean Sea. The same sea into which the river flowed was the source of the wind that blew in the opposite direction. This remarkable coincidence of nature was key to the unification of Egypt. To travel south upriver, a boatman simply raised a sail. The sail, usually a large rectangle of linen or papyrus mats, caught the north wind and pushed the vessel south against the gentle current of the Nile. A trip south was a different experience. It was faster, more energetic. There was the sound of the wind whistling through the mast, the snap of the sail as it filled, the sensation of the boat heeling slightly and cutting through the water, leaving a white wake behind. This was the journey of the government, of messengers carrying the pharaoh's decrees to the southern provinces, of officials inspecting the harvests, of armies moving to defend the southern border in Nubia. Thus, the Nile became a two-lane highway, with a wind-powered express lane to the south and a gravity-driven slow-moving freight lane to the north. This duality was so deeply ingrained in the Egyptian mindset that they incorporated it into their very language. The verb to travel north was krede, which also meant going down the river. The verb to travel south was kent, which also meant going up the river. Geography itself was a verb. The hieroglyph for traveling south was a boat with a raised sail, while the hieroglyph for traveling north was a boat without a sail, often with oars. The simplicity and efficiency of this system cannot be overstated. It allowed Egypt, a civilization stretching over 1,000 kilometers long, but only a few kilometers wide, to function as a single, cohesive entity. Traffic on this river highway was dense and varied, a reflection of society itself. There were the large state-owned cargo barges, wide, flat-bottomed vessels designed for maximum capacity. They were the carts of antiquity, transporting Egypt's wealth. The most important cargo was grain. After the harvest, surplus wheat and barley were collected from local granaries and loaded onto these barges for transport to the state's great silos, in cities like Memphis, Thebes, or the new capitals built by various pharaohs. This movement of grain was the foundation of the pharaoh's power. It allowed him to feed his army, his court, his legion of bureaucrats, and, most importantly, the workers on his vast construction projects. Without river transportation of grain, there would be no pyramids, and then there was stone. High-quality limestone quarries were in places like Tura, near modern Cairo, while granite, the stone of gods and kings, came from much further south, from Aswan. During the annual flood, when water covered the valley, barges could be floated directly to the edge of the desert plateau, close to the construction sites. Stone blocks weighing tens, sometimes hundreds of tons, were dragged between wooden knots onto the barges and then floated downriver with disconcerting ease. The river not only provided the stone by exposing the rock formations, but also the means of transporting it. It was a complete divine construction service. In addition to these bulk cargoes, the river transported everything else civilized life required: ceramic jars, herds of cattle on special barges, woven linen, dried fish, timber, a scarce and precious commodity, often imported, papyrus for the scribes, and, of course, people. An auto official might travel on an elegant wooden vessel with a shaded deck cabin, powered by a team of uniformed oarsmen and a flawless sail. He might pass a merchant on a more modest vessel, with his family and their goods piled high, and both might pass a farming family on a small, fragile papyrus raft, rowing to visit relatives in the next village or to fish in the shallows. The river was the great equalizer and the great classifier. Everyone used it, but an individual's status was immediately apparent by the type of vessel they commanded. Trade was not limited to Egypt's borders. The Nile was the gateway to Africa. The region south of the First Cataract, Nubia, or Kush, as the Egyptians called it, was a land of exotic riches that the Egyptians coveted. Gold from the mines of the eastern desert, dark ebony wood, fragrant incense, ivory from elephant tusks, leopard skins for priests' robes, and even live animals like giraffes, baboons, and monkeys for the pharaoh's zoos and temples. The commercial expeditions south were significant state undertakings. They had to circumnavigate the falls, which often meant unloading the goods, transporting them overland around the rapids, and reloading them onto other boats. It was hard work, but the rewards were worth it. The Nile was the conduit that brought the heart of Africa to Egypt, adding a layer of color, luxury, and mystery to the valley's culture. With so much traffic and so much value flowing up and down the river, it was inevitable that the state, with its insatiable need for organization and revenue, would want to control and tax this movement. This leads us to a historical curiosity that reveals the bureaucratic and meticulous side of the Egyptian mind. The river may have been a gift from the gods, but the trade it enabled was the pharaoh's business. At strategic points along the river, especially at administrative centers and borders, the state established what can only be described as checkpoints or river customs houses. The city of Elephantine, on the island opposite Aswan, was one such post. As Egypt's traditional southern border, all trade from Nubia had to pass through there. Imagine a merchant ship laden with ivory and ebony approaching Elephantine. It would be signaled to dock by a harbor patrol. Scribes from the Treasury Superintendent's office would descend to the dock, their pallets and papyrus scrolls in hand. They weren't pirates, they were accountants, which was perhaps more frightening. They would inspect the cargo, comparing it with the ship's captain's documentation. Every ivory tusk would be counted, every ebony log measured. Then a tax would be calculated. The port tax was paid not in coins, which didn't exist, but in kind. The scribe, with an air of bored authority, would simply select a portion of the cargo, perhaps the 10th ivory tusk, the finest leopard skin, like the one owed to the pharaoh's treasury. The transaction would be duly recorded in triplicate. The ship would receive a clay seal or a note of passage, and only then would it be allowed to continue its journey north. This system didn't just apply to luxury goods. Grain barges were also inspected and taxed, ensuring the state had an accurate record of the wealth moving within its borders. The Nile was an artery of life, but the pharaoh had placed a blood pressure gauge on it to monitor its flow and extract his share. It was a demonstration of absolute control, bureaucracy extending its inky fingers into the river's very current. Thus, the Nile was much more than a blue line on a sand map. It was the backbone of an economic skeleton, the circulatory system of a nation. It united the farmer in his southern field with the baker in the northern city. It united the Nubian gold miner with the jeweler in the pharaoh's court. It united the pyramid builder with the quarry hundreds of miles away. Without this waterway, Egypt would have remained a collection of isolated villages, each a small island of survival. With it, these islands could be strung together like a string of pearls and then fused into a single, solid chain of power and culture. River trade not only moved goods, it moved people. And with the people, it moved ideas, dialects, news, and decrees. It was the constant flow of traffic on the Nile that eroded local differences and forged a unified Egyptian identity. The current that carried everything north didn't just carry mud and water. It carried the very essence of a civilization in the making. And the vehicle for this journey, the small cocoon that transported a piece of Egypt from one place to another, was, in its most primordial form, a marvel of organic engineering. Papyrus's boat. It wasn't an invention imposing itself on the landscape. It was an expression of it. Born from the same marshy banks that gave life to fish and birds, it was a vessel that belonged to the river as much as the water that sustained it. To understand the boat, one must first understand the plant that gave it its name and shape. Imagine the shallow, stagnant waters on the banks of the Nile, especially in the marshy delta. There, in a dense green tangle, grew the papyrus, Cyperus papyrus. It was no fragile reed, but a robust and imposing plant, which could reach heights of up to 5 meters. Its bright green stems were not round, but strangely triangular, a quirk of nature that would become a boon to boat builders. At the top of each stem, an explosion of thin, feathery filaments opened like a delicate umbrella, dancing in the northern breeze. A papyrus forest was a world unto itself, a maze of green stems that blocked vision and muffled sound. The air there was thick with the scent of damp vegetation and fertile mud, and the buzzing of insects was a constant background music. To an outsider, it might seem like an impenetrable barrier. To an Egyptian, it was an open-air warehouse. The decision to use papyrus to build boats wasn't an act of sudden genius, but of inevitable logic. Egypt was, and is, a land poor in quality trees. Wood was a luxury, a material to be used sparingly for the roofs of noblemen's houses, fine furniture, or the sarcophagi of the wealthy. Building thousands of wooden boats for the daily transport of common people and light goods would be an unthinkable waste. Papyrus, on the other hand, was abundant, renewable, and, most importantly, grew exactly where it was needed, at the water's edge. And it possessed a magical quality, natural buoyancy. The stems were filled with air pockets, making them light and effortlessly buoyant. It was the obvious solution, a gift from the Nile ecosystem waiting to be harvested. Building a papyrus boat was a process of almost poetic simplicity, a choreography between man and plant. It began with the harvest. Teams of men waded waist-deep into the dense papyrus thickets. The sharp hissing sound of flint or bronze knives cutting through the thick stalks near their bases echoed through the swamp. The long stalks were then dragged to the shore, where the processing began. The first step was to prepare the stalks. The green fibrous outer bark was often peeled for other uses, such as making sandals, baskets, or ropes. It was the inner core, the white, spongy heartwood, that was the boat's main building material. Builders began by tying a handful of stems together tightly with ropes made from the papyrus's own fibers. They created a long, compact bundle. Then another bundle, and another. The triangular shape of the stems was an unexpected advantage. When tied together, they fit together more compactly than round stems, leaving less empty space between them. These primary bundles were then gathered and tied together to form even larger bundles. Slowly, the shape of the boat began to emerge. The hull was not hollow like that of a wooden boat. It was a solid body of bound papyrus, more like a carved raft than a ship. The most ingenious part of the process was creating the elegantly upward curving bow and stern, an iconic feature of Egyptian vessels. To achieve this, the builders tied thick ropes to both ends of the hull's main beam. They then pulled these ropes tightly, bending the ends upward while the papyrus was still green and pliable, as if tying the laces of a giant shoe. The ends were then fixed in this elevated position, giving the boat its graceful crescent moon silhouette. This curvature wasn't just aesthetic. It helped the boat navigate the dense thickets of reeds and papyrus without getting stuck, and it also kept the bow above the river's small waves, preventing the boat from submerging. The end result was a vessel that looked incredibly organic, as if the swamp itself had decided to transform itself into a means of transportation. It was light, flexible, and happily biodegradable. The experience of traveling in a papyrus boat was unlike any other. It didn't ride the waves with the rigidity of a wooden boat. It flexed with the water, moving with the river instead of fighting against it. And the most remarkable thing wasn't that it was waterproof. In fact, it was far from it. The papyrus boat was a diving champion. It would become waterlogged almost immediately, absorbing water until it became heavy and saturated. But because of its air-filled cellular structure, it didn't sink. It floated low in the water, its deck frequently wet. Water wasn't an intruder. It was a constant companion on the journey, gently percolating through the interwoven fibers beneath the passengers' feet. This meant the papyrus boats had a limited lifespan. After a few months of constant use, they became so heavy with water that they lost their buoyancy and had to be dragged ashore to dry in the sun, or simply abandoned to disintegrate back into the river mud from which they came. But that wasn't a problem. Raw materials were free and abundant, and building a new boat was a quick process. The papyrus boat was the epitome of sustainable disposables. These small boats were the workhorses and family wagons of the Nile. Fishermen used them to cast their nets in the shallow waters. Families used them to cross the river or visit relatives. Small traders loaded them with pots, fish, or vegetables to sell at the market in the neighboring village. And, crucially, they were the elite's leisure and sporting vessels. This is one of the most widely known and vividly portrayed historical facts about Egyptian life, thanks to tomb walls. The tombs of nobles, especially in the New Kingdom, are filled with vibrant scenes depicting the deceased enjoying the pleasures of marsh life in a papyrus boat. Picture the scene. A nobleman dressed in his finest white linen stands in a rickety papyrus boat, 1 foot forward for balance. In one hand, he holds a throwing stick, a kind of non-returnable boomerang. Around him, his wife, elegantly dressed and holding a lotus flower to her nose, clings to his leg for stability. His children, naked and small, cling to his other leg or point enthusiastically at the target. The target is an explosion of life, a flock of birds, startled from a dense papyrus thicket, flying in all directions. The nobleman is at the height of his movement, about to throw his staff to bring down some birds for dinner. Below the boat, in the vibrant blue water, enormous fish swim among the lotus flowers. It's a scene of abundance, family, and mastery over nature. And the stage for all this domestic and sporting drama is the humble papyrus boat, the vehicle that allowed civilized man to enter the wild heart of the swamp. The great question that loomed over papyrus boats for centuries was their limit. They were clearly perfect for rivers and swamps, but could they brave the open sea? Could they be the vehicle for the legendary expeditions the pharaohs sent to the distant land of Punt? Or even beyond? Most modern Egyptologists were skeptical. A waterlogged boat didn't seem a likely candidate for ocean crossings. And this brings us to one of the most famous and romantic historical curiosities of the 20th century, the Rhea expeditions of the Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl. Heyerdahl, a man of almost mythical scientific stubbornness, was convinced that ancient civilizations were far more connected by sea than academics believed. He believed the Egyptians might have crossed the Atlantic in papyrus boats, influencing the cultures of the Americas. To prove it, he decided to do what every good adventurous scientist does: build one and give it a try. In 1909, Heyerdahl commissioned boat builders from Lake Chad in Africa, who still maintained reed boat-building traditions, to build a large papyrus vessel near the pyramids of Giza. The result was the Ha, a 15-meter-long ship built from 12 tons of papyrus from Lake Tana in Ethiopia. With an international crew of 7, it set sail from Morocco to cross the Atlantic. The expedition was a high seas drama. The Haxo proved surprisingly seaworthy, but a construction error, based on later Egyptian models, caused its stern to drag and become waterlogged. After weeks of fighting, with the ship slowly disintegrating beneath them, they abandoned it a few hundred miles from their destination, bearded. For many, it was a failure. For Heyerdahl, it was a lesson. The following year, 1870, he tried again. The Ha-2 was built, this time, by boat builders from Lake Titicaca, Bolivia, who had a different and more efficient technique for tying together bundles of reeds. The new boat was more robust, and its stern remained high. This time, after a voyage of 57 days and over 6,000 kilometers, the Ha-2 arrived triumphantly in Barbados. Heyerdahl didn't conclusively prove that the ancient Egyptians made the voyage, but he did prove that they could have. He demonstrated that a papyrus boat, built with ancient knowledge, was not just a river raft, but a remarkably capable ocean-going vessel. He rehabilitated the papyrus boat, transforming it from a primitive swamp boat into a potential transoceanic vessel of discovery in the popular imagination. Despite Heyerdahl's demonstration, the truth is that for serious sea voyages and the transport of heavy loads, the Egyptians eventually turned to wood. But the papyrus boat never disappeared. It remained the people's vehicle, the daily means of transportation for the vast majority of Egyptians for millennia. It was a symbol of their intimate relationship with the river. They didn't need to conquer nature with complex technology. They simply took a piece of nature, tied it to another piece of nature, and used it to navigate the rest of nature. It was a system of perfect harmony. The papyrus boat was more than a tool. It was a floating piece of the Nile itself, a cradle made of reeds that carried the Egyptian people along the artery of their civilization, always assured of wet feet and an unbreakable connection to the water that gave them life. And as it glided silently into that aquatic world, it became a key, unlocking the door to an ecosystem of a richness and complexity that dazzled the imagination. A realm where life and death danced a slow waltz in the shallow, sunlit waters. Setting sail from the main shore in one of these fragile boats was like passing through a portal. The open world of the valley, with its wheat fields and orderly villages, gave way to a pulsating green labyrinth. The sound changed instantly. The rustling of the wind in the fields was replaced by the constant, moist whisper of millions of papyrus and reed stalks rubbing against each other. It was a sound of secrets, an invitation to listen more closely. The air, anti-dry and dusty, became thick and heavy, laden with the fragrance of chlorophyll, mud, and the subtle sweetness of decaying aquatic flowers. The buzzing of dragonflies with iridescent wings and the deep, resonant croak of hidden frogs created a hypnotic soundtrack. The background music of creation in its rawest state. This was the heart of the Nile, its inner sanctuary, and it was a place of stunning beauty and hidden danger. The walls of this world were the plants themselves. The papyrus, with its triangular stems and feathery crowns, formed dense forests that rose from the water, creating shaded channels and secret clearings. Among them grew reeds and reeds of all kinds, their thin, flexible stems swaying in unison with the slightest breeze. These reeds were used to weave the mats that covered the floors of houses, the baskets that carried grain, and the ropes that tied papyrus boats together. The swamp's flora wasn't just decoration. It was nature's hardware store and supermarket. But the undisputed jewel of this verdant kingdom was the lotus flower, which the Egyptians called session. There were two main varieties, the white lotus and the blue lotus. They didn't float passively on the surface. They actively participated in the day's cycle. The white lotus opened its petals at night, while the blue lotus, more common and intensely fragrant, opened with the first rays of dawn and closed at dusk, following the sun god on his journey. For the Egyptians, this behavior was not botanical. It was theology. The lotus was the symbol of rebirth and creation. From the primordial ocean of Num, the first being to emerge in some versions of the myth was a giant lotus flower. When its petals opened, they revealed the young sun god, Ra, within. The fragrance of the blue lotus was considered the very perfume of divinity. The god Nefertum, often depicted as a beautiful youth with a lotus flower on his head, was the personification of this divine aroma and primordial beauty. It was customary to offer lotus flowers to the gods in temples and to guests at banquets. People wore them in their hair, and reliefs show men and women holding an open flower to their noses, inhaling deeply its fragrance, as if breathing in the very essence of life. To glide through a clearing covered in open lotus flowers on a sunny morning was to be enveloped by a cloud of sweet, intoxicating perfume, a sensory experience that confirmed that the gods were, indeed, very close. Beneath this tapestry of plants, another world teemed with life. The waters of the Nile were an aquarium of epic proportions. Fish of all sizes and shapes moved in silvery schools. There was the enormous Nile perch, a predator that could reach the size of a man, and the strange-looking catfish, its sensitive whiskers sweeping the slender bottom in search of food. But no fish was as significant as the humble tilapia. This unassuming fish was the mainstay of the protein diet for most Egyptians, caught with linen nets, copper hooks, or multi-pronged harpoons. But its value went far beyond the stomach. The Egyptians, patient observers of nature, noticed fascinating behavior in tilapia. This is a well-documented biological and historical fact. The female tilapia incubates her eggs and protects her newborn fry inside her mouth. When the danger passes, she releases them, apparently giving birth to fully formed fish from her mouth. For the Egyptians, obsessed with the idea of rebirth, this was a daily miracle. Tilapia became a powerful symbol of regeneration and new life. Tilapia-shaped amulets were extremely popular, worn to ensure fertility and a successful rebirth into the afterlife. Eating tilapia wasn't just about nourishment. It was about participating in a cycle of renewal. Above the water, the air was as teeming with life as the river below. Egypt was a crucial stop on migration routes, and its marshes were a haven for birds. The noise could be deafening. Flocks of geese and ducks honked and flapped their wings in a constant cacophony. Gray herons, with their gray elegance, stood still as statues in the shallows, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce with their sharp beaks. Pelicans flew in formation, their enormous throat pouches flapping. Kingfishers, like blue and orange jewels, dove into the water like living arrows, and among them all moved a bird of silent dignity and sacred purpose. The ibis, with its white body, black neck and head, and long curved beak. The ibis was the living embodiment of Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and magic. Thoth was the scribe of the gods, the one who recorded the judgment of the dead and who gave humanity the knowledge of hieroglyphics. The association with the ibis may have come from the way the bird probes the mud with its curved beak, a movement reminiscent of a scribe dipping his quill into an ink pot. To see an ibis was to see wisdom walking, and to kill one, even accidentally, was a serious crime. But this green and blue Eden had its monsters. The swamp was a place of beauty, but not of innocence. Beneath the calm surface, ancient dangers lurked, and the first was a master of deception, the hippopotamus. The river horse, as the Greeks would later call it, looked from a distance like a gentle giant. It spent most of the day submerged, with only its eyes, ears, and nostrils visible above the water, like tiny living islands. The sound of a hippopotamus's yawn, a cavernous roar echoing through the marsh, was one of the Nile's signature sounds. But this sleepy, plump appearance was a sham. The hippopotamus was, and still is, one of the most dangerous animals in Africa. They were fiercely territorial. A dominant male would not hesitate to attack a papyrus boat that invaded its space, ripping the fragile vessel in half with its powerful jaws, capable of opening nearly 180 degrees and armed with long, sharp ivory tusks. At night, they would emerge from the water to graze in the fields, and a single herd could devastate a family's harvest in a matter of hours. They were a pest and a deadly threat. However, in the complex Egyptian mind, terror was often the flip side of reverence. The same ferocity that made the male hippopotamus a demon of destruction made the female a symbol of protection. The goddess Taweret, the great protector of pregnant women and childbirth, was depicted as a female hippopotamus, standing on her hind legs with a prominent pregnant belly and woman's breasts. Its ferocious appearance was not meant to frighten humans, but to ward off demons and evil spirits that threatened mother and baby at the most vulnerable moment of their lives. The hippopotamus was, therefore, both a monster to be hunted and a goddess to be worshipped. But if the hippopotamus was the brute and unpredictable force of the swamp, the other great predator was the embodiment of cold and calculating patience, the Nile crocodile. He was a piece of primordial time, a reptile who hadn't changed much since the age of the dinosaurs. He spent hours motionless on the shore, looking nothing more than an aged, wrinkled log, absorbing the sun's heat. But his lidless, yellow eyes were always watching. He was a master of the ambush. Any animal that came to the water's edge to drink, a gazelle, a goose, or even a careless human, risked being grabbed by jaws that closed with explosive force and dragged to a spinning death underwater. The fear the crocodile inspired was profound and visceral. However, as with the hippopotamus, this fear turned into worship. The crocodile god, Sobek, was a powerful deity associated with the pharaoh's strength, fertility, and military might. In cities like Kamambo in southern Egypt, magnificent temples were built in his honor, where live crocodiles were kept in sacred tanks, pampered, and fed the finest offerings. They were adorned with gold jewelry and lived a life of reptilian luxury. When they died, they were mummified with the same care as a nobleman, wrapped in fine linen and buried in special cemeteries. The crocodile represented the sudden death that lurked in the water, but it was also a god who promised power and protection. This practice of mummifying sacred animals is one of the strangest and most fascinating facets of Egyptian religion. And this brings us to a historical curiosity that reveals the industrial scale that faith could reach. Animal worship wasn't limited to pampered crocodiles in a temple. Millions of ordinary Egyptians expressed their devotion by purchasing a mummified animal as a votive offering to their favorite god. If you wanted to ask a favor of Thoth, the god of wisdom, you would buy a mummified ibis and deposit it in a sacred catacomb. If you wanted to appeal to Bastet, the feline goddess, you would buy a mummified cat. Demand was so great that it led to the emergence of a colossal industry. At sites like Thuna el Gabel and Saqqara, archaeologists have discovered underground catacombs that are veritable cities of the dead for animals. Tunnels stretch for miles beneath the desert, their walls filled, floor to ceiling, with millions of clay pots, each containing the mummy of an ibis or a falcon. Recent X-ray analyses have revealed the truth behind this industry. Many of the animals did not die of natural causes. They were raised on sacred farms, on an industrial scale, specifically to be sacrificed and mummified. Ibis breeders would break the birds' necks when they reached the right age. Some mummies, in fact, are fakes. Empty jars or jars filled with only a few feathers and a piece of bone sold to unsuspecting pilgrims. It's a disconcerting sight. the profound piety of a people coexisting with a chain of mass death and commercial fraud, all in the name of the gods. The sounds emanating from these sacred farms, the cackling of thousands of ibises destined to become offerings, must have been a very peculiar soundtrack to faith. Life and death, the sacred and the profane, the beautiful and the terrifying, all intertwined in the Nile ecosystem. It was a complete world, a microcosm of the Egyptian worldview itself. Every creature, every plant, had its place, its purpose, and its divine counterpart. It was a web of interdependence, with the river as the thread that united them all. At dusk, as the sun set in the west and tinted the sky orange and purple, a new set of sounds emerged. The croaking of frogs grew louder, the buzzing of mosquitoes more insistent. The roar of a hippopotamus echoed in the distance. From the edge of the desert, a hyena might let out its sinister cackle, coming to drink. The Nile didn't sleep. It merely changed shifts. And to the Egyptian, in his little papyrus boat or his mud brick house, these sounds were not threatening. They were the constant pulse of life, the breath of a world that the river created and sustained. And the lyrics of this song, its deepest and most insistent message, was a single, powerful word: rebirth. The idea that life could simply end was, to the logical Egyptian mind, an affront to the overwhelming evidence presented to them every day, every season, every sunrise. The universe, as they knew it, did not operate in straight lines that led to dead ends. It operated in circles, in spirals, in cycles of comforting beauty and predictability. And the most eloquent teacher of this philosophy was the Nile. He not only suggested the possibility of rebirth, he demonstrated it on a monumental scale, year after year, with a punctuality that would shame any lesser god. The most visceral and immediate symbol of this rebirth was the earth itself beneath their feet. During the Zemu season, the land seemed to die. The sun beat down, the moisture evaporated, and the fertile soil turned into a pale, cracked crust. The valley took on an exhausted, almost depleted appearance. It was the earth on its deathbed, gasping under the bronze sky. And then came the flood, the great plunge into the watery chaos of the Nuh. The earth disappeared, dissolved, undone. To a pessimistic observer, it would be the end. But the Egyptian knew it was just an interlude, and when the waters receded, the miracle would repeat itself. What emerged was not the same tired earth as before, but a new virgin land, dark and pulsating with potential. The black mud, the kemetes, was physical proof that death was not a final state, but a purification, a prelude to a new, even richer life. Each seed planted in this new soil was an act of faith, a participation in the resurrection of the earth itself. The cycle of the soil, from life to death to rebirth, was the fundamental paradigm that shaped their entire understanding of existence. Nature echoed this lesson on smaller, more poetic scales. The Egyptian saw rebirth in the blue lotus flower, which closed into a tight bud at dusk, plunging into the watery darkness like the sun in the underworld, only to reopen its petals with the first light of morning, immaculate and perfect, offering its divine fragrance to the new day. Each dawn was the rebirth of the lotus, and they saw, perhaps even more powerfully, in the humblest of beings, the scarab beetle. Today, we know it as the dung beetle, a somewhat inelegant name for a creature of such theological importance. The Egyptian watched this small insect with its shiny black carapace work tirelessly in the sun. He would shape a ball of dung, a material of death and decay, and patiently roll it across the sand. This act, for them, was a mirror of the sun's journey. The dung ball was the solar disk, and the beetle was the god Khepri, the manifestation of the rising sun that rolled the orb across the sky each day. But the miracle didn't stop there. The beetle buried this ball of dung, and sometime later, new young beetles emerged from it, seemingly born from nothing, spontaneously generated from the dead matter. It was self-generation, life sprouting from decay. The scarab, Khepir in Egyptian, became the hieroglyph for the verb to become, to transform. It was the walking promise that even from what is base and corrupt, new life can emerge. Scarab amulets became ubiquitous, small symbols of hope worn by everyone from pharaohs to farmers, a reminder on the chest or finger that every form of darkness is followed by a new dawn. These symbols of nature were earthly manifestations of the great divine drama that confirmed the promise of rebirth, the myth of Osiris. The story of his murder, dismemberment, and resurrection was the divine script for human hope. Osiris was not a god who escaped death. He was a god who conquered it by passing through it. He became the lord of the underworld, not as a demon, but as a just king. The first to make the journey and prove that there was an afterlife, organized and benevolent. Every Egyptian who died did not face the unknown. He or she followed in the footsteps of Osiris. Death was simply the beginning of one's own Osirian journey. The goal was not to avoid judgment, but to be like Osiris, true of voice, considered righteous on the scales of Ma'at, and thus earn the right to live forever in the reed fields, an idealized version of the Nile Valley itself, with crops that never failed and rivers that never ran dry. If death was merely a transition to a new form of being, then the physical body, the earthly shell, assumed crucial importance. And here we enter the realm of mummification, the most widely known and macabrely fascinating historical fact about ancient Egypt. Mummification was not a morbid attempt to create zombies. It was a profoundly practical and theological act of faith. The Egyptians believed that the human personality was composed of several parts. Two of the most important were the Ka, the life force or spiritual double, and the Ba, the soul or personality, often depicted as a bird with a human head. After death, the Ka and Ba left the body, but for the deceased to be reborn in the afterlife, they needed to be able to return to and recognize their physical home. If the body decomposed, the soul would be lost, and eternal life would be impossible. Mummification was, therefore, a sacred technology, designed to preserve the body as an eternal anchor point for the soul. The process was a solemn art, a ritual lasting 70 days, mirroring the period when the star Sirius disappeared from the sky before its heliacal rebirth. The body was taken to the house of purification, where the embalmers, specialized priests, began their work. They removed the rapidly decomposing internal organs through an incision in the abdomen. The brain was removed in a somewhat less dignified manner, being liquefied and extracted through the nostrils with long bronze hooks. The heart, considered the center of intelligence and emotion, was generally left in place, as it would be needed for judgment in the afterlife. The body was then covered and stuffed with natron, a natural salt found in dry lake beds, which acted as a powerful dehydrating agent. For 40 days, the body rested in natron, which slowly extracted all moisture, the source of decomposition. What remained was a dried and shrunken, but perfectly preserved human form. The final stage was wrapping. The body was cleansed, anointed with fragrant oils and resins, and then meticulously wrapped in hundreds of yards of fine linen bandages. It was a long and meditative process. Between the layers of linen, the priests placed dozens, sometimes hundreds of magical amulets, scarabs for rebirth, the pillar for stability, the eye of Horus for protection and healing. Each amulet was a spell in solid form, placed in a specific location to protect that part of the body. The mummy became a spiritual fortress, a sacred cocoon from which the reborn soul could emerge. It was the human imitation of the cycle of nature. Just as the grain was buried to be reborn as a green plant, the body was wrapped and buried to be reborn in the glory of the afterlife. But preserving the body was only the first step. A perfectly mummified body was still an inert vessel. For rebirth to be complete, the deceased's senses needed to be magically reactivated. To achieve this, the Egyptians developed one of their civilization's strangest and most specific rituals, the opening of the mouth ceremony. This is our historical curiosity, an act of liturgical theater that served as a bridge between the inertia of death and the activity of eternal life. The ceremony was performed on the day of the funeral, in front of the tomb entrance. The mummy, in its sarcophagus, was placed in a standing position, supported by a priest wearing the mask of the god Anubis. The chief priest, the Shem, who was often the deceased's eldest son and heir, then began the ritual. He used a set of special tools. The most important was a kind of adze or gouge, called a pizesh kef, often made of meteorite, the iron from heaven, which gave it celestial power. With chants and recitations from the Book of the Dead, the priest ritually touched the mouth, eyes, nose, and ears of the mummy, or the sarcophagus mask, with the various tools. Each touch was an act of resuscitation. By touching the mouth, he restored the deceased's ability to speak, eat, and drink in the afterlife. By touching the eyes, he restored their sight. Touching the ears, hearing. Touching the nose, breathing. It was a complete sensory resuscitation. In some depictions, the ritual also involved the sacrifice of a calf. The animal's still writhing foreleg was presented to the mummy's mouth as a potent symbol of the transfer of life force. The opening of the mouth ceremony was the final spark, the divine electric shock that transformed a preserved shell into a functioning being for eternity. It was confirmation that rebirth was not merely a vague spiritual continuation, but a full bodily and sensory existence, a life much like that of Egypt, only without the sickness, sorrow, or a bad harvest. From the black mud rising from the waters to the final touch of a celestial tool in a mummy's mouth, the concept of rebirth permeated every fiber of Egyptian civilization. It was no vague hope or abstract philosophy. It was a system, a technology of the soul, with clear rules, symbols, and procedures. The Nile didn't just teach them how to grow wheat. It taught them how to cultivate eternity. He showed them that every ending was an illusion, that every plunge into darkness was the necessary prelude to a return to the light. Life was a series of transformations, not endings. And so, the farmer who watched his fields disappear beneath the flood, the woman who watched the lotus close at dusk, and the child who cried at the funeral of a loved one, all shared the same fundamental certainty, whispered by the river each day. Nothing is truly lost. Everything returns. Leonardo Nilo's song was a promise that, for those who understood its rhythms, there would always be a new dawn. And this shared promise, this collective faith in the cycle of renewal, became the invisible mortar that held together the mud bricks of the scattered villages. The same current that carried papyrus boats north also carried ideas, beliefs, and customs. The river was not just an economic artery, it was a cultural nervous system, transmitting pulses of shared identity from one end of the black earth to the other. Slowly, but with the same certainty as the annual flood, the Nile was forging a nation. Imagine Egypt before it was Egypt. It was a mosaic of communities, each nestled in its own bend in the river, each with its own skyline of palm trees and cliffs. Life was local. The most important god was the god of that locality, the crocodile of that particular cove, or the hawk that haunted that stretch of desert. Traditions were shaped by immediate experience. A village in the delta, with its wide marshes and multiple river branches, had a different worldview and skill set than a village in Upper Egypt. The Nile was a river squeezed into a narrow, rocky valley. For a long time, these local cultures could have developed in completely different directions, becoming as distinct as those of separate nations. But the Nile didn't allow it. It acted as a vast mixer, a geographic blender that, over the centuries, transformed disparate ingredients into a homogeneous and flavorful cultural soup. The main agent of this mixing was movement. As we've seen, the river was a two-lane highway. An elephantine trader in the far south could load his boat with granite and ivory and, with little difficulty, float downriver to the markets of Memphis, near the delta. On his journey, he didn't just transport goods. He transported himself. He carried with him his dialect, the stories of his local gods, the gossip of his village. Upon arriving in Memphis, he traded his granite for grain, flax, or perhaps copper tools. And along with these goods, he absorbed the culture of the North. He heard a slightly different dialect. He would learn about Pitha, the creator god of Memphis, and perhaps adopt a new style of pottery that he found particularly useful. When he finally set sail and began the long voyage back south, against the current, he was no longer the same person. He took with him pieces of northern culture, which he then reintroduced to his home community. Multiply this interaction by thousands of boats over hundreds of years. The result was a slow but inexorable process of cultural cross-pollination. The Nile ensured that no community could remain isolated for long. Ideas flowed as easily as water. If a new irrigation method, such as the construction of a more efficient basin dike, was developed in one region, the news and the technique traveled quickly upstream and downstream. If a new style of amulet became popular in one town, it would soon appear on market stalls hundreds of miles away. This is a fundamental historical fact. Ancient Egypt's cultural unity is remarkable in comparison with other regions, such as Mesopotamia, where neighboring city-states maintained fiercely distinct identities and frequently warred with one another. In Egypt, despite an initial period of conflict, the prevailing trend was toward unification, and the geography of the Nile was the main reason for this. Ease of communication and transportation simply made unity a more logical and efficient option than division. Religion is perhaps the best example of this river-driven syncretism process. As communities interacted, their local pantheons began to overlap and merge. Rather than one city conquering another and imposing its god, what more often occurred was a friendly merger. The Egyptians were theologically pragmatic. If the falcon god of one city closely resembled the falcon god of another, the obvious conclusion was not that one was wrong, but that both were worshipping the same deity under different names. Over time, local gods were absorbed into a larger national pantheon. A local crocodile god became a manifestation of Sobek. A local sun god was identified with Ra. Horus, the the celestial falcon god, absorbed dozens of lesser falcon deities from across Egypt. This process culminated in the rise of a god who symbolized the very idea of unification. Amun. Originally, the local and rather obscure patron god of the city of Thebes in Upper Egypt, Amun began his rise when Theban princes reunited the country and established the new kingdom. As Thebes became the religious and administrative capital of the empire, its god became the king of the gods. But he did not replace the sun god Ra, the longtime supreme deity of the north, with his cult center at Heliopolis. Instead, in a stroke of political and theological genius, the two were merged. They became Amun-Ra, a composite deity who united the power of the south with the tradition of the north. He was a god who belonged to all Egypt, and his great temple at Karnak in Thebes became the Vatican of the ancient world, his influence and wealth spreading throughout the valley, carried up and down the Nile. The unification was not only cultural and religious, it was, above all, political. The very notion of the Egyptian monarchy was rooted in the geography of the river. Tradition held that Egypt had once been two separate lands: Upper Egypt, the river valley in the south, and Lower Egypt, the delta region in the north. The history of Egypt as a unified nation begins, according to tradition, with a southern king, often identified as Narmer or Menes, who conquered the north around 3100 BC. This is one of the most pivotal events in Egyptian history. From this point on, the pharaoh was not just a king, he was the lord of both lands. His official crown, the phoenix, was a combination of two separate crowns: the white crown, Rege, of Upper Egypt, and the red crown, Deshret, of Lower Egypt. Each time the pharaoh placed this double crown on his head, he was making a political statement. I am the one who holds Egypt together. And the Nile was the physical axis on which this union revolved. The river was the zipper that held the two halves of the Egyptian coat closed. Control of the Nile was control of Egypt. Any ruler who could guarantee the free flow of traffic and trade along its entire length ruled a unified and prosperous nation. If the river was blocked by local warlords or by rebellion, the country would fragment. Egypt's history is a series of intermediate periods, times of disunity and kingdoms, times of unity. And the difference between them was almost always the degree of centralized control over the river. This practical and political unification, however, gave rise to a cultural peculiarity that persisted for millennia and serves as our historical curiosity. Despite being a single country under a single king for over 3,000 years, the Egyptians never completely abandoned the idea that Egypt was fundamentally two separate lands, bound together in a somewhat tense union. This duality was embedded in their worldview and bureaucracy. The government was not just the government of Egypt, it was the administration of both lands. The treasury was not one, but two. The White House, the treasury of Upper Egypt, and the Red House, the treasury of Lower Egypt. The titles of many high-ranking officials reflected this division. An official could be the overseer of the granaries of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's as if a modern government insisted on having a treasury secretary for the north and a treasury secretary for the south, even though both worked in the same building and served the same president. This administrative duality reflected a mindset that saw balance as the key to cosmic order. The universe was made of complementary opposites: day and night, life and death, order and chaos. And of course, Upper and Lower Egypt. The pharaoh's role was to maintain these opposites in a state of harmonious balance. The dual bureaucracy was, therefore, not an inefficiency. It was a reflection of the structure of the cosmos. It was a way of honoring the separate history and identity of the two regions, even within a unified state. Duality was a constant in their art as well. The walls of temples and tombs are full of symmetry. If a god is depicted on one side of a door, another god often appears in a mirror image on the other side. The pharaoh is often shown being crowned simultaneously by the patron goddesses of Upper Egypt, the vulture goddess Nekhbet, and of Lower Egypt, the snake goddess Wadit. This need for balance, this insistence on duality, was the fingerprint that the geography of the Nile, a long river connecting two distinct regions, left on the soul of the nation. The Nile united Egypt practically, enabling trade and communication. It united it religiously, blending local pantheons into a national faith, and it united them politically, making centralized control of the river the basis of the pharaoh's power. But perhaps most importantly, it gave the Egyptians a shared identity. A man from Aswan and a woman from the Delta, despite their differences, shared the same fundamental experience. Both depended on the same flood. Both observed the same star. Both planted in the same types of soil. They both told the same stories about Osiris and Ra, and they both sailed on the same river. The Nile was their common homeland. It was the thread that wove them together into a single, rich, and enduring cultural tapestry. The cultural tapestry, woven from the threads of belief, politics, and shared experience, was not a work of art to be admired from afar. It was a cloak to be worn, lived in, and celebrated. The Egyptian people's gratitude for the river that gave them everything was not an abstract feeling reserved for silent prayers. It was a noisy joy, a communal celebration that exploded with colors, sounds, and aromas, transforming the river's rhythm into a calendar of festivities. Each phase of the Nile's cycle was a cue for a festival, an opportunity for the community to gather, give thanks, celebrate, and perhaps drink a little more beer than usual. Egyptian festivals were not like modern holidays, days off marked on a calendar. They were immersive events, moments when the barrier between the sacred and the secular dissolved completely. They were part religious ritual, part village fair, and part carnival. And the largest and most important festivals were naturally synchronized with the pulse of the Nile. They didn't just mark time, they helped ensure the cycle continued. Participating in a festival wasn't just about having fun. It was a civic and religious duty, a way to contribute to the maintenance of Ma'at, the cosmic order. The beginning of the Egyptian New Year, marked by the reappearance of Syrians and the imminent arrival of the flood, was greeted with the Vapet Hempet festival, the opening of the year. It was a time of joy and relief. Shemu's period of drought and anxiety was over, and the river's promise was about to be fulfilled. It was a celebration of renewal, a time to leave the old behind and embrace the new. People cleaned their homes, got rid of old objects, and donned new clothes. Special offerings were made in temples to appease the gods and ensure a favorable flood. It was a time of cautious optimism, of watching the rising waters with a mixture of hope and a silent prayer that the flood would be neither too high nor too low. However, the most spectacular festival associated with the flood was undoubtedly the beautiful Festival of the Valley. This was one of the most important events in the religious calendar of Thebes, the great capital of the New Kingdom. It was a celebration that united the world of the living and the world of the dead, the east and west banks of the Nile, in a glorious procession. The festival occurred during the Zimu season, the low water period, but its symbolism was entirely tied to the renewal that the flood would bring. The focus of the festival was the cult statue of the god Amun-Ra, who resided in the deepest and darkest sanctuary of the vast temple of Karnak on the east bank. Once a year, the statue of Amun, accompanied by statues of his wife, the goddess Muti, and his son, the moon god Khonsu, was removed from its sanctuary. It was a moment of great excitement, as the common people never saw the god's image except on these occasions. The statue, hidden inside a portable golden chapel, was placed on a magnificent ceremonial barge, also gilded and adorned with the heads of rams, Amun's sacred animal. This bark would then be carried on the shoulders of dozens of priests in a solemn procession, leaving the gates of the temple of Karnak. The atmosphere outside the temple would be one of festive frenzy. The entire city of Thebes would be in the streets. Music was everywhere, the sound of harps, lutes, and flutes, and the pulsating rhythm of drums and cisterns, the sacred rattles wielded by priestesses. Dancers, acrobats, and singers performed for the crowd. The smell of burning incense mingled with the aroma of roasting meat from the food stalls, and the scent of the lotus flowers and garlands everyone wore. The procession moved slowly toward the banks of the Nile. There, the sacred bark was carefully loaded aboard an even larger riverboat. The Uzurhat Amun, mighty is the forehead of Amun, a colossal vessel made of the finest cedar wood from Lebanon and covered in gold. The ship, towed by smaller vessels and accompanied by a flotilla of boats filled with pilgrims and spectators, then crossed the Nile toward the west bank, the land of the dead. The river crossing was the symbolic heart of the festival. It was Amun, the god of life and creation, visiting the realm of the dead to rejuvenate both the spirits of the deceased and the funerary temples of the kings. Upon reaching the west bank, the procession continued overland, stopping at several important temples, such as Hatshepsut's, Ender el-Bahari's, and the Hameseum. It was a divine visit, an infusion of life-giving power into the realm beyond. But the festival wasn't just for the dead gods and pharaohs. For the common people, it was a chance to reconnect with their own deceased relatives. Families crossed the river in their own boats, carrying food, drink, and flowers. They went to their ancestors' tombs in the hillside necropolises and spent the night there, having a picnic at the tomb. They ate, drank, and sang, sharing the meal with the spirits of their loved ones. It was believed that during the festival, the boundary between worlds was blurred, and the dead could share in the joy of the living. It was a bittersweet celebration, a celebration of life amid the graves, a reaffirmation of the belief that death was not the end of family ties. At dawn, when Amun's bark returned triumphantly to the east bank, it was as if the sun itself were reborn, having recharged its batteries in the realm of the dead, ready to bring a new cycle of life to Egypt. Another festival of immense importance was the festival of Opé, also centered in Thebes. If the beautiful festival of the valley was about the connection between the living and the dead, the festival of Opé was about the rejuvenation of the power of God himself and, by extension, of the pharaoh. This festival was even longer and more elaborate, lasting nearly a month at its peak. The procession was similar to the bark of Amun leaving Karnak, but instead of crossing the river, it traveled south for about 2 miles to the Luxor Temple. The Luxor Temple was not a funerary temple, but was considered the site of the pharaoh's divine birth, and the place where Amun underwent a rejuvenating transformation, merging with his fertility aspect, Amun-Min. The journey could be made by land, along an avenue lined with hundreds of sphinxes, or, more spectacularly, by river. The river procession was a breathtaking sight. Amun's great ship, accompanied by a fleet of government and public boats, moved slowly along the Nile. The banks would be crowded with people singing, dancing, and cheering. Upon arriving in Luxor, the statue was taken deep into the temple, where secret rituals were performed for weeks. It was believed that during these rituals, the Kasi, the life force of Amun and the king, were renewed and merged. When the statue finally emerged and returned to Karnak, the divine power of the universe had been recharged for another year, and the pharaoh's legitimacy as the intermediary between gods and men had been reaffirmed. The people celebrated loudly, for a rejuvenated god and a powerful king meant a stable and prosperous Egypt. The festival was a grand act of political and religious theater, using the Nile as its main stage. Although Thebes was the center of these grand state celebrations, river-related festivals took place throughout Egypt on a more modest scale. And this brings us to a charming and somewhat strange historical curiosity: the Festival of Drunkenness. This festival, associated with the goddess Hathor, and sometimes other dangerous goddesses such as Sekhmet, commemorated a fundamental myth. The story goes that the sun god Ra, angered by humanity's rebelliousness, sent his daughter to the goddess Sekhmet to punish them. Sekhmet, with the fury of a lioness, began to slaughter humanity. She enjoyed the carnage so much that she refused to stop. Seeing that humanity was about to be annihilated, Ra had to intervene. He ordered thousands of beer jugs dyed red with ochre or pomegranate juice to resemble blood. This blood beer was then poured over the fields. Sekhmet, thinking it was blood, began to drink it greedily. She drank so much that she became completely drunk, fell asleep, and forgot her murderous rage. Upon awakening, her destructive nature had transformed into the benevolent and loving goddess Hathor. Humanity was saved by beer. To commemorate this event and appease the goddess's dangerous aspect, the Festival of Drunkenness was held. And the name wasn't a metaphor. The goal of the festival was to literally drink oneself into oblivion. Men and women gathered at temples of Hathor, where large quantities of beer and wine were provided. They drank, danced, and played music frantically until they passed out. It was believed that by reaching this trance-like state, or unconsciousness, they could commune directly with the goddess, crossing the threshold between worlds. Temple texts describe participants being awakened in the morning by temple drummers. Waking from an alcoholic coma to the sound of temple drums seems a uniquely Egyptian experience. It was a form of ritualized disorder, a plunge into chaos to celebrate the return of order, a way to thank the goddess for her mercy by becoming completely and ritually drunk in her honor. Beer, a direct product of the wheat made possible by the Nile, was not just food and drink. It was also a sacramental tool, the divine antidote to celestial fury, from the golden processions of Amun-Ra to the mass swoons in honor of Hathor. Festivals were how the Egyptians lived their relationship with the Nile and their gods. They transformed dependence into celebration, fear into reverence, and the cycle of nature into a human and divine drama. The river wasn't just a source of water and mud. It was a source of joy, a reason to gather, to sing, to dance, and to connect with community. Ancestors and the cosmos. And at the center of this celebration of the river's bounty was a divine figure who personified the flood itself, a god who needed no complex creation myths or celestial battles. The god Hap was not a king of the heavens or a judge of the dead. He didn't wield lightning bolts or command legions of demons. His power was more subtle, more fundamental. It was the power of sustenance. Siam-Ra was the imperial heart of Egyptian theology, beating with power and gold. Hap was the digestive system, the god whose good humor ensured the nation never went hungry. His worship was marked not by cosmic drama, but by a sense of deep gratitude and annual anxiety, a relationship much more akin to that of a farmer with the weather than that of a subject with a king. He was, in essence, the Nile at its most active and generous. He was not the river as a static entity, but the flood itself personified. Therefore, he did not have a single main cult center, like Amun in Thebes or Ptah in Memphis. Hap's temple was in the Nile Valley itself, and his sanctuary was wherever the water overflowed and deposited its fertile silt. However, his official residence, his source, was believed to be in a cave or grotto on Bijay, a rocky island near the first cataract in Aswan. This was the southernmost tip of Egypt, the place where the flood was first seen. Imagine the priests and watchmen posted there, observing the Nilometer day after day. When they saw the waters begin to rise and change color, it was as if they were witnessing Hap himself emerging from his cave, stretching his limbs, and beginning his slow, generous journey north. Reliefs in the region's temples show Hap living in his cave, surrounded by serpents, symbols of the earth's primordial power, pouring water from 2 jars, one for each of the mythical Niles, which were believed to feed the river. His appearance, and already mentioned, was unique and deeply symbolic. He was a god, but his body defied the conventions of masculinity. His large, protruding belly and heavy, pendulous breasts were not signs of obesity or weakness, but of an androgynous, overflowing fertility. He was the nurturing father, the masculine force of the flood that inseminated the land, and the mother who nursed the nation with her abundance. His blue or green skin evoked water and new vegetation, and the headdress on his head was a map of Egypt's sacred geography. If he was representing the Nile in Upper Egypt, he wore a headdress of lotus plants. If he was personifying the Nile in Lower Egypt, he used a bundle of papyrus stalks. Often, 2 figures of Hap were shown together, one with a lotus and the other with papyrus, tying the 2 plants in a knot around the hieroglyph to unite them. This image, known as Sema Tawi, was the heraldic symbol of the unification of the 2 lands. Hap was not just the provider, he was the unifier, the force that literally bound Egypt together. Worship of Hap was less about stone temples and more about practical rituals and hymns of supplication. The hymns to Hap are among the most beautiful and heartfelt texts in Egyptian literature. They don't speak of battles or divine genealogies. They speak of famine and joy, drought and plenty. They address Hap with a mixture of reverence and familiarity, almost as if speaking to a wealthy but somewhat unpredictable relative. A famous hymn says, "When he overflows, the earth is glad. Every belly rejoices, every jaw laughs, and every tooth bears itself." The hymn continues describing how Hap brings fish to the fishermen, vegetation to the flocks, and above all, the grain that is the basis of life. But there is also a tone of supplication. The hymn implores Hap not to delay, so that his flood will be perfect. If he failed, the nose would be blocked, and everyone would be poor. The gods would not receive their offerings, and men would die. It was a direct acknowledgement that the entire structure of civilization, from the humblest meal to the richest offerings to the greatest gods, depended on the mood of this single being. The most important ritual for Hap was simply to offer him back some of the abundance he brought. During the height of the flood, people would gather on the riverbanks. Priests and lay people would throw offerings directly into the turbulent waters. They were offerings of food, cakes, bread, fruit, and Hap figurines, perhaps in the hope that Hap would recognize his own image and feel generous. Texts speak of offerings of desert birds and animals being thrown into the river. It's a powerful image. Egypt, the land of order, offered a piece of the desert's chaos back to the river, perhaps as a sacrifice to maintain balance. These offerings were believed to be carried by the current back to her cave in Aswan, like a gift of thanks delivered to her door. The river was not just a passive receiver, it was a divine delivery system. The relationship with Hap was so vital that it became part of the pharaoh's own identity. The king was the primary intermediary between the people and the gods, and his most important task was to ensure the flood arrived. It is a widely known historical fact that the success or failure of the flood was seen as a direct reflection of the effectiveness of the pharaoh's reign. If the floods were good and the harvests plentiful, it was a sign that the pharaoh was in harmony with the gods and maintaining Amayat. If there was a drought or a catastrophic flood, this could be interpreted as a sign that the king had lost divine favor, a politically dangerous situation. Therefore, the pharaoh was often depicted making offerings directly to Hap. He was the high priest of the flood cult, and his ability to intercede with Hap was the basis of his legitimacy. In some texts, the pharaoh and Hap are almost conflated. The king is called Hap to his people, the one who nourishes and sustains the land. It was an immense responsibility to be the human guarantor of a divine natural phenomenon. With such total dependence on a single source of life, it's no surprise that the Egyptians were also wary of offending it. And this brings us to a fascinating historical curiosity about purity and pollution. The Egyptians, despite living in a dusty and muddy environment, were obsessed with cleanliness, both physical and ritual. They believed the river was inherently pure and sacred. Polluting the Nile was a grave sin, a direct offense to Hap and Osiris, whose body had been carried by its waters. In the famous negative confession of the Book of the Dead, a list of sins the deceased declares not to have committed to prove their worthiness at judgment, one of the crucial statements is, "I did not pollute the water." Another is, "I did not build a dam against the flowing water." This suggests that undue interference with the natural flow of the river, as well as its contamination, was a cosmic offense. This belief had practical implications. For example, spitting into the Nile was considered an act of great disrespect. The idea of throwing garbage or sewage directly into the river, though likely done out of necessity, was viewed as religious disapproval. This reverence for this purity of water also extended to what was taken from it. Priests serving in temples had to undergo rigorous purification rituals. Herodotus, the Greek historian, notes that Egyptian priests bathed in cold water several times a day and night, and they had to avoid certain foods considered impure. Surprisingly, one of these forbidden foods for the priests was Nile fish. While fish was a staple food for the common people, it was considered impure for those who served the gods. The exact reason is debated, but one theory is that certain fish were associated with the chaotic god Seth. Recall the myth of Osiris. When his body was dismembered, his phallus was eaten by a fish. Eating fish, therefore, could be seen as participating, even symbolically, in the desecration of a god's body. It was a taboo that separated priest from layman, a constant reminder that proximity to the sacred required a diet of exceptional purity. The river that fed them all was also a source of taboos that defined social hierarchy. The cult of Hap, with its mixture of supplication, gratitude, and anxiety, was the most direct expression of the Egyptians' relationship with their environment. He was a god unencumbered by complex myths, for his story was visible to all. He needed no narrative of the creation of the world, for he recreated the Egyptian world each year. He was the deity of the full belly, the sound of rising water, the smell of wet earth, and the sight of green bursting from the black soil. In a pantheon filled with distant sun gods and rulers of the underworld, Hap was the god you could feel underfoot and taste in your bread. And it was along the banks this god touched, on grounds hallowed by his annual passage, that Egyptian civilization sanctified its deepest stakes, building not just mud houses, but centers of power and ceremony that would organize and shape its culture for millennia. The transition from village to city in ancient Egypt was not a process of urban planning as we know it. It was an organic growth, a thickening of life along the river, like a clot forming in a vein. A village could become an important center for a variety of reasons. It might be at a strategic trading point, such as at the confluence of a desert caravan route with the river. It could be near a source of valuable resources, such as a quarry or a mine. Or, more commonly, it could be the home of the cult of a particularly powerful or charismatic god. As the local god gained prominence and was absorbed into the national pantheon, its hometown also gained in status. The small reed and mud shrine that housed his image was replaced by a stone temple, and the surrounding village was transformed into a temple town. These towns were not the bustling, chaotic metropolises we imagine today. They were, in essence, villages on a larger scale, still built predominantly of mud brick and organized around the necessities of agrarian life. But they had a new beating heart, the temple complex. The temple was not just a place of worship, like a modern church or mosque. It was the economic, administrative, and intellectual center of the city. Imagine the temple complex as a combination cathedral, central bank, university, and headquarters of a large corporation. It owned vast tracts of land, donated by the pharaoh or wealthy patrons. The harvests from these lands flowed into the temple's vast granaries and treasuries, making it the largest employer and landowner in the region. Life in the city revolved around the rhythm of the temple. At dawn, the priests performed the ritual of awakening the statue of the god, opening the doors of its sanctuary, cleansing it, dressing it in fine clothing, and offering it a sumptuous meal. Meanwhile, outside the temple walls, the city awoke to work. Craftsmen who worked for the temple, carpenters, jewelers, and sculptors, went to their workshops. Scribes went to their offices to record the temple's income and expenses, draw up contracts, and copy sacred texts. Farmers who worked the temple grounds brought their produce to the granaries. The city was a hive of activity, and honey flowed to the temple. Cities like Memphis, the capital of the ancient kingdom, strategically located near the apex of the delta, became cosmopolitan centers. Memphis was home to the great temple of Ptah, the craftsman and creator god. It was also the administrative center of the kingdom, the place where the pharaoh's bureaucracy resided, and where wealth from the turquoise mines of Sinai and toward expeditions to Phoenicia arrived. Later, Thebes in the south, with its temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor dedicated to Amun-Ra, became for a time the largest and richest city in the world, a center of imperial power whose influence extended from Nubia to Syria. And there were sacred cities, such as Abydos, the center of Osiris's worship. Abydos was not a major political capital, but it was the spiritual center of Egypt, It was the most important pilgrimage destination. Being buried in Abydos, or at least having a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb, there was the greatest hope for many Egyptians, as it guaranteed proximity to the great god of the dead and an easier passage to the afterlife. The banks of the Nile were thus dotted with these centers of varying types and sizes, each a jewel in a long necklace. But the relationship between the city and the river was complex. The Nile was the source of life, but also a constant threat. The cities were built on high ground, but an exceptionally high flood could still wreak havoc. To protect themselves, the cities were surrounded by massive mud brick walls. These walls weren't just for military defense. They were, first and foremost, gigantic dikes. The known historical fact is that Egyptian cities were essentially fortified islands, designed to withstand the annual flood. During high water, the water would reach the base of these walls, transforming the city into a watery fortress, connected to the outside world only by raised causeways or boats. Living in an Egyptian city was like living within a containment basin, a space of human order surrounded by the controlled chaos of the river. Within these walls, life was compact. The streets were narrow and winding, designed to create shade. The multi-story houses huddled together, their whitewashed walls reflecting the intense sunlight. The sound of the city would be a constant hum of voices, the hammering of artisans, the cries of market vendors, and the omnipresent bleating of animals. The smell would be a potent mix of baking bread, incense from the temples, dust, sweat, and the less pleasant odor of garbage and sewage, which was often simply dumped into the street. Life was public and communal, with little privacy. But the riverbank was not only the site of the cities of the living, it was also, and perhaps more spectacularly, the site of the cities of the dead. And this brings us to a curiosity that challenges our modern understanding of the city. The Giza Plateau, on the west bank of the Nile, across from modern Cairo, is the most famous example. For us, it's an archaeological site, a collection of iconic monuments. For the ancient Egyptians, it was a necropolis, a city of the dead. But it was much more than a cemetery. It was an active and functional community, with its own population, economy, and infrastructure, dedicated entirely to serving the deceased kings and elites buried there. At the foot of the Great Pyramids of Cheops, Khafre, and Mycerinus, archaeologists have discovered the remains of a vast city. It wasn't a city of slaves, as popular Hollywood myth would have us believe. It was a city of skilled workers, artisans, and priests. There were organized barracks that could house a rotating workforce of thousands of men. There were industrial-scale bakeries and fishmongers with facilities to bake thousands of loaves of bread and dry thousands of fish daily to feed this workforce. There were copper workshops, where the tools used to cut stone were manufactured and repaired. There was an administrative complex, with the offices of the scribes who managed this monumental logistics. And there was a port connected to the Nile by a canal, where boats carrying stone, food, and workers docked. It was a temporary but highly organized city dedicated to the construction project. But life in the necropolis didn't end when the pyramid was completed and the king was buried. That was just the beginning. Every pyramid and every nobleman's tomb was endowed with a funerary cult. This was a trust fund, usually in the form of agricultural land, whose produce was intended to sustain the deceased's Ka for all eternity. A body of priests, known as servants of Ka, was appointed to perform the daily rituals in the funerary temple attached to the pyramid. Their role was to present offerings of food and drink to the soul of the dead king, ensuring that he would not suffer hunger or thirst in the afterlife. These priesthoods were hereditary positions. A family could serve a king's funerary cult for generations. Living in the necropolis city, supported by revenues from donated lands. Thus, the city of the dead was, in fact, a very living city. It had a permanent population of priests and their families, guards who protected the tombs, artisans who maintained the temples, and farmers who worked the cult's lands. These cities of the dead, with their gleaming temples and orderly streets, were often cleaner, better planned, and wealthier than the cities of the living, which tended to be more organic and overcrowded. It was a massive investment in the afterlife, an entire economy dedicated to serving the departed. The Nile, therefore, flowed not only between the cities of the living, but also between the cities of the living and the cities of the dead, carrying the offerings and the priests who maintained the connection between the two worlds. The river was the bridge that united generations, ensuring that the wealth generated by the living could continue to sustain the dead, in an economic symbiosis that spanned the veil of death. The riverbank was, therefore, a landscape of profound complexity. It was a place of life and death, work and worship, order and chaos. The cities were points of concentration of power, where the wealth generated by Nile agriculture was transformed into temples, armies, and bureaucracies. The ceremonial centers were the portals through which this wealth was transferred to the divine realm, ensuring the favor of the gods and the continuation of the cycle. Everything was interconnected, with the river as the guiding thread, from the humble fishing village with its reed huts to the vast Karnak complex with its sky-scraping obelisks. Each structure was a tribute to the bounty of a river that not only nourished bodies, but also built civilizations. The river, that immutable and eternal artery, was not simply a backdrop to Egyptian history. It was history itself, flowing through time, a constant in a world of rising and falling dynasties, of empires built and crumbled. The river was there before the first pharaoh, and remained long after the last. It was the liquid timeline of the nation. When we look back at Egypt's long and winding history, with its more than 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization, it's easy to get lost in the dazzling procession of figures and monuments. There's Cheops and his Great Pyramid, a feat of engineering that still leaves us perplexed. There's the enigmatic Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled as pharaoh and built a funerary temple of breathtaking beauty. There is the rebel Akhenaten, who attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion, and his son, Tutankhamun, whose untouched tomb revealed the riches of a golden age. And there is Ramesses the Great, the master of propaganda, who covered Egypt with statues and temples in his own image. Each of them, with their ambition, their faith, and their mortality, was a powerful ripple on the surface of time. But the river they sailed on, the current that sustained them and saw them through, was the Nile. It was the silent protagonist, the underlying force that made all these stories possible. Egyptian civilization was not merely dependent on the Nile, it was an expression of the Nile. Its social structure reflected the irrigation hierarchy. At the top, the pharaoh, the master of the canals, the guarantor of the flood. Below him, the high officials and priests, the engineers and administrators who managed the distribution of water and grain. And at the base, the vast population of farmers, whose labor in the fertile mud supported the entire pyramid. It was a social system as stratified and ordered as the network of canals they dug in the earth. Their worldview, as we have seen, mirrored the river cycle. Creation from the watery chaos, the struggle between order, the black earth, and chaos, the red desert, and the unshakable promise of rebirth. Eternity, for them, was not an abstract concept of infinite time. It was the endless repetition of a perfect cycle, the cycle of the Nile. This total dependence on a single source of life was both Egypt's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. As long as the Nile behaved as expected, civilization flourished with remarkable stability. Geographic isolation, afforded by the deserts to the east and west, the cataracts to the south, and the sea to the north, protected Egypt from the invasions and disturbances that plagued other civilizations of the ancient Near East. Egypt could afford to look inward, to perfect its art, religion, and bureaucracy in splendid isolation. The river provided everything it needed, creating a self-sufficient and, frankly, somewhat smug culture. The Egyptians saw themselves as the center of the universe and their land, blessed by the Nile, as the only truly civilized one. All the others were wretched Asians or contemptible Nubians. It was arrogance born of predictable abundance, but when the Nile failed, the whole structure trembled. It's a well-known historical fact, though less glamorous than the battles and treasures, that climate change and fluctuations in the Nile's flood pattern were crucial factors in the collapse of great kingdoms. The end of the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, was marked by a period of severe droughts. Floodwaters were consistently low, leading to poor harvests and widespread famine. A text from the period, known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, laments a world turned upside down. Behold, the river is full of blood, but men drink it out of thirst. The desert spreads across the land. The earth turned like a potter's wheel. Famine undermined the pharaoh's authority, who could no longer fulfill his divine promise to provide. Central power disintegrated, and Egypt plunged into the chaos of the first intermediate period. The lifeblood was failing, and the nation's body convulsed. History repeated itself. The stability of the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom was intrinsically linked to more regular periods of flooding. And the final decline of pharaonic Egypt, its conquest by a succession of foreign powers, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and finally, Romans, coincided with periods of greater climatic instability. The new rulers, especially the Romans, viewed Egypt not with the reverence of a native people, but with the pragmatism of an imperial master. For Rome, Egypt was simply the breadbasket of the empire. The Nile was not a god to be worshipped, but a resource to be exploited. The goal was to extract as much grain as possible to feed the population of the city of Rome. The delicate balance between man and the river, maintained by millennia of tradition and ritual, was replaced by relentless exploitation. Even under Roman rule, the Nile continued to dictate terms. Grain production still depended entirely on the annual flood. Roman governors, like the pharaohs before them, anxiously watched the Nilometers, knowing that political stability in Rome could depend on how high the water reached in Memphis. The Nile was the artery that now fed not just a kingdom, but an entire empire, which for centuries continued to fulfill its role. The pharaonic civilization had disappeared. The ancient gods were forgotten or replaced. The temples fell into ruins, and the language of hieroglyphics became a mystery. But the river continued to flow, to flood, and to recede. And the farmers, the fellahim, continued to sow their seeds in the dark mud, using tools and techniques that their ancestors of 3,000 years earlier would have instantly recognized. The pulse of the Nile lasted longer than any dynasty. The Great Change, the first fundamental interruption in this 5,000-year cycle, only came in the 20th century. And this brings us to our final historical curiosity, one that marks the end of one geological era and the beginning of another. In 1970, construction of the Aswan High Dam was completed. It was a monumental feat of modern engineering designed to control flooding once and for all, provide hydroelectric power, and allow year-round irrigation. In many ways, it was the fulfillment of every pharaoh's ultimate dream: absolute control over the river. The annual flood, the force that had shaped the land and soul of Egypt for millennia, was tamed. The god Hap was placed in a concrete straitjacket. The impact was profound and ambivalent. Egypt was freed from the threat of catastrophic floods and drought-induced famine. Agricultural production increased dramatically, as it was now possible to harvest multiple crops per year. The nation was electrified, but at a price. The dam has trapped the fertile silt, the Nile's annual bounty, behind its massive walls. Lake Nasser, the vast reservoir created by the dam, is slowly filling with Ethiopia's rich soil. Egyptian farmers, for the first time in history, have had to begin using large-scale chemical fertilizers to compensate for the loss of the silt. The delta ecosystem, deprived of sediment replenishment, began to suffer from erosion and saltwater intrusion. The cycle that had defined Egypt was broken. The eternal artery now had an artificial pacemaker. The Aswan High Dam is, in a sense, Egypt's last great monument, a modern heir to the pyramids and temples. It is a testament to the human desire to control nature, to impose order and predictability over chaos. But in doing so, it also ended the millennia-long dialogue between a people and their river. The Nile's lullaby, with its verses of flooding, growth, and harvest, has been silenced. The river still flows, of course. It is still Egypt's source of life, more crucial than ever in a country with a growing population. But it's no longer the same river. It no longer breathes with the seasons. It has become a predictable channel, a tamed servant of human need. As we look back over the long and serene flow of Egyptian history, we see that Egypt's history is, at its core, the biography of its river. From the first drops of rain on the distant mountains, through its epic journey across the desert, to its apotheosis in the delta, the Nile was the sculptor of a landscape and a civilization. He shaped the earth, fed the people, inspired the gods, and united a nation. He was the road, the calendar, and the promise of eternity. The pyramids may one day erode to dust, the hieroglyphics may fade, but the memory of the river, the eternal artery that pulsed through the heart of one of the world's greatest civilizations, will continue to flow in the human imagination. A silent and powerful testimony to the dance between nature and culture, a dance that on the banks of the Nile achieved almost perfect harmony.